She was 19 and freezing. No home. No heat. No spare coat. Just a rusted Buick key and the $10 bill she had kept flat in her sock after returning cans behind a Duluth grocery. And with that $10, she bought an abandoned cedar canoe builder's shed near Ely, in St. Louis County, Minnesota, where a logging spur called Birch Narrows had fallen off county maps in 1968. The roof had opened a black seam over the rafters. One corner had sunk until the floor held snow. The county said the building had been closed since 1987 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the belly of a cast-iron steam-bending tube, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 40 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sadie Lenore Voss had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She did not grow up in one house long enough to learn the particular complaint of its stairs. Her childhood was measured in borrowed bedrooms, county folders, winter coats with other children's initials written on the tags, and the slow way adults lowered their voices when she entered a room. She had been born on the Iron Range, in a hospital where the windows looked toward slag piles and tamarack bogs, but no one in her early papers could agree on whether her first home stood in Chisholm or just outside Boole. The difference mattered to no one except Sadie, who liked things exact. There were gaps in her file. A school secretary once used that word while Sadie sat on a vinyl chair with her knees together and her hands folded in her lap. Gaps. As if a life were a floorboard missing here and there, and a careful person might simply step over the openings. Sadie learned early not to ask too often. Questions made some grown people tired. They rubbed the bridge of the nose, or looked at the clock, or said, "Not today, sweetheart," when nothing sweet had been offered. So she learned to watch instead. She watched how a woman at a kitchen sink knew which knife belonged in which drawer. She watched how a man coming in from snow took off his boots without thinking and set them side by side near the heat register. She watched families argue over supper and forgive each other before the plates were rinsed, as if forgiveness were another chore belonging to the house. None of it stayed near her for long. By the time Sadie was 12, she knew the smell of every public building that had held her. Courthouse wax, school paste, church basement coffee, the warm dust of library radiators. She knew the way a social worker's car felt on a Friday afternoon, when a brown paper bag of clothes sat beside her feet and the future had been reduced to an address written in blue ink. She carried little. She kept a pencil stub, 2 photographs she could not explain, and a button from a coat that had been lost 3 placements before. The button was dark horn, smooth from being handled, and she kept it because it had belonged to something. In those years, belonging seemed less like affection and more like proof. It meant an object had a proper place and was missed when absent. Sadie wanted that kind of life with a hunger so steady she stopped naming it. Her mother existed first as a name typed in county language, then as a blurred face in a photograph that showed a young woman sitting on the hood of a green pickup beside a lake. The woman had one hand raised, not exactly waving, and the wind had lifted her hair across her mouth. Someone had written Miriam Voss. August. On the back. No year. No town. No explanation. Her father was less than that. He was a blank line. Then a rumor. Then a man one foster father claimed had worked seasonal timber near Orr and gone west before Sadie was born. She never knew whether to believe it. Men in kitchens sometimes supplied missing fathers the way they supplied weather predictions, with confidence and no responsibility. The closest thing Sadie had to a mother in her first years was a county worker named Helen Arbogast, who wore wool skirts in every season and kept peppermint candies in the left drawer of her desk. Helen never hugged Sadie, not even once, but she remembered which schools had been unkind and which homes had too many children already. She spoke to Sadie as if facts could be a form of mercy. "You are not a mistake," Helen told her once, while fastening a seatbelt that had twisted under Sadie's hip. "You are a child in a hard system." Sadie did not understand the sentence then. She understood the carefulness of it. Helen had not said everything would be fine. She had not said God had a plan, or that good girls were rewarded, or that time healed what time had no business touching. She had placed the truth on the seat between them, plain and unpainted, and Sadie trusted it more than comfort. A father figure came and went. Two, though none stayed long enough to become one. There was Mr. Peavy in Virginia, who taught her how to check motor oil and made waffles on Sundays. There was quiet Mr. Lind in Eveleth, who gave her a red tackle box for her 13th birthday and then moved to Arizona after his wife died. There was a church deacon in Hibbing who let her sand hymn boards in the basement while other children were at vacation Bible school. Each man left one small competence behind: oil on a rag, a square knot, how to pull a bent nail without splitting pine. Sadie kept those lessons the way another girl might have kept jewelry. Then, when she was 14, Helen Arbogast found a relative. He was not close enough for the county to place her with him, and not far enough to ignore. His name was Arden Voss, Miriam's older brother, and he lived alone in a narrow house near two harbors with stacks of cedar leaning beneath the eaves. He had a beard that came in white at the chin, a left hand missing the tip of the ring finger, and a way of listening that made even a child's unfinished sentence feel worth the time it took. The first Saturday he came for her, he drove a blue Ford truck that smelled of wool, sawdust, and pipe tobacco he no longer smoked. He stood in the foster home doorway holding his cap in both hands and looked at Sadie for a long moment, not searching her face for likeness, but receiving it. "You have your mother's eyes," he said. Sadie had heard that before, from people who wanted to offer something without knowing what was true. From Arden, the words landed differently. He did not smile after saying them. He looked toward the floor, swallowed once, and added, "She watched things all the way through." That became the first honest inheritance he gave her. For 3 years, Arden took her every other weekend when weather allowed. The county called it family visitation. Arden called it shop time. His workshop stood behind his house, built low against the wind, with a stove made from a barrel and a long workbench scarred by 60 years of blades. Cedar boards lay in careful stacks, each one stickered to breathe. White ash strips hung from rafters. Patterns for ribs and stems leaned against the wall with dates written in pencil along their edges. He built canoes the slow way. Not the bright fiberglass hulls sold to vacationers along Highway 61. Not aluminum rentals that rang against stones and carried dents like bruises. Cedar canoes shaped by steam, hand pressure, memory, and patience. He had learned from their grandfather, he said, who had learned from men along the border lakes before engines became common, and silence still had a practical use. The work began with wood chosen in winter, when sap was low and the grain told fewer lies. It continued through shaving, soaking, heating, bending, cooling, fitting, fastening, and waiting. Always waiting. Sadie's first job was sweeping. Arden taught her to sweep with the grain of the floorboards so slivers did not rise beneath the broom. Then he taught her to sharpen a pencil with a knife, to mark a cut on the waist side of the line, to keep both hands behind an edge, to listen when cedar split because a crack spoke before it traveled. On Saturday mornings, He put coffee on for himself and cocoa for her. They ate toast at the bench while the stove clicked and the shop windows silvered with frost. By the second winter, he let her help with the steam tube. It was a black iron length, nearly as tall as Sadie when set on its stand, capped at one end and fitted to a kettle rig Arden had repaired more times than he had counted. When water began to boil, the tube breathed through its seams with a wet metal sigh. Cedar ribs went in stiff and pale. After enough time in heat, they came out smelling of rain, bark, and something faintly sweet, ready for the bending form if a person moved quickly and did not panic. "Do not fight it," Arden would say, setting her gloved hands where the rib needed coaxing. "Wood knows when you are afraid." They bent ash stems together. They clamped them into curve. They laced temporary forms with cotton cord and weighed them with stones when a bend wanted to lift. He taught her the difference between pressure and force. Pressure asked. Force broke. That distinction entered Sadie more deeply than arithmetic, more deeply than school prayers, more deeply than the foster mother's rules waiting for her on Sunday evenings. There was a ritual to those weekends. Friday dusk, the truck ride north. Saturday before dawn, stove lit, kettle filled, shavings gathered. Noon, soup from a dented pot. Afternoon, standing by the window while Arden told one story from the family and one from the water. Sunday morning, church bells heard from far off but rarely attended. Sunday afternoon, the return drive, both of them quieter as they got closer to whatever house held Sadie that month. He never promised to save her. She trusted him partly for that. Once, after she ruined a rib by hurrying the bend, Sadie stood with the broken piece in her hands and waited for the familiar adult sigh. Arden took the cedar, ran his thumb along the torn grain, and laid it on the bench. Wood remembers water. "Sadie, so you ask it slow." She looked at him, stung by the gentleness more than a rebuke would have stung. He explained that every tree had spent its life carrying weather upward, drinking thaw and rain through dark earth, holding years in rings no one saw until the saw opened them. Steam did not make wood forget what it was. It reminded it of what it had once been willing to do. A craftsperson did not command that memory. A craftsperson made room for it. Sadie did not have words for why that mattered. But she carried the sentence for years, repeating it under her breath whenever she needed her hands to stay steady. The last winter she spent with Arden came early and hard. Snow packed against his shop door by November, and Lake Superior turned the sky the color of hammered lead. He had been coughing since October. He said it was sawdust, then weather, then stubborn lungs, and because he was a man who had lived alone too long, the explanations came with a shrug. On the first Saturday of December, Sadie arrived to find the stove unlit. Arden sat at the bench wearing his cap indoors, his hands wrapped around an enamel cup gone cold. The shop seemed to have paused around him. Cedar strips rested in their clamps. A paddle blade lay half-shaped beneath a curl of pale shaving. The steam tube stood empty and dark on its iron legs. He smiled when he saw her, but the smile cost him. They did not work much that day. He showed her how to oil a spokeshave and how to wrap blades in cloth before storage. He opened a drawer and took out a bundle of notebooks tied with cotton string, then hesitated, as if hearing another voice from another room. Sadie remembered that hesitation later. At the time, she only saw that his fingers were trembling. "These are not ready," he said. "For what?" "For whoever needs them." He put the notebooks back and closed the drawer. 3 weeks later, he was gone. Pneumonia was the word given to Sadie because death often arrives first as a word, flat and official. The county did not take her to the funeral. The foster mother said roads were bad, and there was no sense catching sickness over a man who had not even been legal custody. Sadie sat that morning in a bedroom that smelled of cold laundry and listened to the furnace start, stop, and start again. By spring, Arden's house had been cleared. A cousin from Wisconsin claimed the truck. Someone took the tools. The cedar stacks disappeared board by board. The shop door stood open for a week. Then the property was sold to a man who wanted the land for a rental cabin. Sadie walked there once after school, having lied about a club meeting, and found a dumpster in the yard filled with torn patterns, cracked molds, broken clamps, and curled shavings darkened by rain. She climbed into the dumpster in her school shoes. From beneath a strip of tar paper, she rescued a bent awl, a sanding block, and half of a paddle pattern with only the lower curve remaining. She found no notebooks, no family photographs, no forms marked with Arden's careful pencil dates. The loss was not loud. It was worse for being ordinary. A trade that had crossed hands for generations had been treated as debris by men paid by the hour. She carried the broken pattern home under her coat. By 16, Sadie was living in a split-level outside Duluth with Marjorie Weller, the foster mother who would later send her into winter with a garbage bag and a birthday cake still cooling on the counter. Marjorie's house was clean in the places visitors saw. The living room had matching lamps, framed mall prints of sailboats, and a glass bowl of wrapped candies no child was meant to touch. The hallway carpet smelled faintly of carpet powder. The kitchen calendar came free from a bank and had every county payment date circled in red. Marjorie had once been pretty in a firm, polished way, and she seemed to resent the work age had done on her without permission. She wore her hair sprayed into a shape that wind could not alter and kept her lipstick in a mug beside the telephone. She was not a woman who shouted often. She preferred silence with edges. A cabinet closed too carefully. A plate set down with exact force. A pause before answering that made the person waiting understand they had become a burden. Her husband, Cal, drove a plow for the city and spent evenings in a recliner beneath the blue wash of television. He was not cruel in a dramatic sense. He simply took up space and allowed whatever happened near him to happen. When Sadie brought home library books, he moved them from the coffee table to the floor with 2 fingers, as though they carried dust. When she came in late from work study, he looked toward Marjorie before deciding whether to speak. The Weller house had rules written nowhere and enforced everywhere. Milk was counted. Laundry days were assigned. The phone was not for Sadie unless a school office called. Heat rose from the vents in measured portions, and if she complained of cold, Marjorie told her to put on socks. At dinner, Marjorie asked about grades in the same tone she used for expiration dates. Cal chewed with his mouth slightly open and watched the local news. Sadie survived there by becoming useful. She washed dishes before being asked. She shoveled the walk straight to the edge. She kept her shoes beneath the basement stairs and her few private objects hidden inside the torn lining of a suitcase. At school, teachers called her mature, which usually meant she caused them no additional labor. At night, she copied canoe shapes from memory on notebook paper, trying to reconstruct Arden's forms from what her hands remembered. The lines were never right. Still, she drew them. Marjorie noticed the drawings once. "What are those?" "Canoes." "Planning to paddle away?" Sadie closed the notebook. Marjorie smiled without warmth. "Make sure you own the boat first." After that, Sadie drew only in the public library, where no one asked why a girl kept sketching curved ribs and narrow stems when other students were filling out college forms. She sat near the local history shelves because that corner was warmest, and because the librarians let silence belong to everyone equally. Sometimes she searched old newspapers for the name Voss. Sometimes she found Arden in brief notices about craft fairs or small boat shows. Once she found Miriam's high school graduation listing. She touched the microfilm screen lightly, as if a fingertip could receive what blood had not. Her 18th birthday arrived on a Thursday, under a sky that had been white since morning. There was a cake on the Weller counter, still in its aluminum pan, frosted with grocery store vanilla and decorated with pink roses that had begun to crust at the edges. Sadie had not asked for it. Marjorie bought cakes because the receipts proved occasions had been observed. A single candle lay beside it, unlit. Cal's boots stood on the mat, melting road salt into gray puddles. Sadie came home from her shift at the diner with dishwater cracks across her knuckles and the smell of fryer oil in her hair. She had brought Marjorie's mail from the box without looking through it. That was a house rule. Marjorie sat at the kitchen table with 3 envelopes opened in front of her, one from the county, one from the state, and one with a bank logo Sadie knew from the calendar. The red circles had ended. A black trash bag stood beside the basement door. Sadie recognized the sleeve of her brown sweater pressing against the plastic from inside. Her suitcase was there, too. The zipper strained, the handle wrapped with duct tape where it had split 2 winters earlier. On top lay Arden's broken paddle pattern, which Marjorie must have found in the lining. Sadie looked at the bag, then at the cake. Marjorie did not rise. Cal sat in the living room, television low, the back of his head visible above the recliner. Snow clicked against the kitchen window in hard grains. Checks stopped. Sadie, you cannot stay here anymore. 8 words. Marjorie delivered them neatly, almost without breath between them, then folded one of the county letters along its original crease. She did not look at the cake. She did not look at the candle. She did not look at the girl whose birthday had become an accounting change. Sadie waited for something from the living room. A shift in the chair. A muttered objection. The slow decision of a man remembering he was present. Cal lifted the remote and turned the volume up 1 notch. Marjorie's silence did the rest. It was the older betrayal, the one that had been practicing for years in the careful closing of cabinets and the counting of milk. Sadie took the trash bag first because it was lighter than humiliation if lifted quickly. Then the suitcase. Then the broken paddle pattern, which she slipped under her coat. She did not cut the cake. She did not take the candle. At the door, she paused long enough to put on her boots, tying them with numb fingers while snow breathed through the open frame. Marjorie said nothing else. Outside, the driveway had already begun to disappear. Sadie crossed it carrying everything that had been permitted to remain hers. The Buick sat at the curb, a 1998 Le Sabre with rust above the wheel wells and a heater that worked only when the engine was warm and the fan felt merciful. She had bought it from a dishwasher at the diner for $200 and a promise to finish paying when tips improved. It started on the 4th turn. That first night, she slept behind the closed laundromat on Central Entrance in Duluth, under a security light that blinked every 11 seconds. She knew the number because counting gave her something exact to hold. The car windows frosted from the inside. She wore 2 shirts, her diner sweater, and the brown coat Marjorie had once bought from a church sale. At 3 in the morning, a plow passed so close the Buick rocked on its tired shocks, and snow struck the doors like thrown gravel. She had $63.40 in her wallet then, not counting the $10 bill she had folded into wax paper and tucked inside her sock. That bill had come from cans, not wages, and for reasons she did not examine, she treated it differently. Her diner pay would arrive the next Friday if the manager did not decide her missed shift meant she had quit. The gas gauge hovered above a quarter tank. Her phone had 17% battery and no charger that worked unless the car did. For 6 weeks, Sadie moved the way a person moves when staying anywhere too long becomes dangerous. She slept one night in the parking lot of a 24-hour grocery in West Duluth, waking each time automatic doors sighed open for customers carrying bread and milk into the heated world. She spent $4 on gas and 99 cents on a day-old roll, then sat in the car, tearing it into pieces so it would last longer than hunger wanted. She washed in the restroom at a Super One Foods, using brown paper towels and the last of a travel soap taken from Arden's house years before. Its scent had faded almost entirely, but when she rubbed it between her palms, cedar returned for one brief second. She drove to Superior because someone at the diner said a motel there needed cleaners. The job had already been filled. She slept behind a warehouse near the harbor, where the wind moved over the ice with nothing to slow it, and the ship's horn sounded like animals lost in fog. Her money fell to $41 after gas, a phone cord from a gas station bin, and 2 cans of soup she ate cold with a plastic spoon. In Cloquet, she parked near a church whose sign promised grief support on Tuesdays. A woman leaving choir practice tapped on the window and asked whether she had somewhere to go. Sadie said yes because the woman's kindness seemed too delicate to burden with the truth. The woman stood there anyway, wearing red mittens, and handed Sadie a paper cup of coffee through the cracked window. "Cream and sugar," she said. "It is too cold for plain." Sadie held the cup with both hands until the heat hurt. There were other places. A rest stop outside Scanlon where truck brakes hissed all night. The far end of a hospital parking lot in Hibbing, chosen because no one questioned cars near hospitals. A hay barn north of Cotton, where she slept in the Buick until the cold became too complete, and then crawled into loose hay that smelled of dust, mice, and summer stored past its season. In Virginia, she spent 3 days using the public library as shelter, sitting upright at a table with an open book before her while her socks dried inside her boots. The Buick's heater failed for good during the 5th week. It began as a rattle behind the dash, then a smell like hot dust, then nothing. Sadie drove with a wool blanket across her lap and one mittened hand curled around the wheel. At stoplights, she scraped the inside of the windshield with a grocery cart. Frost gathered along the edges of her hair while she watched exhaust rise from other cars and vanish. Her money became a private weather report. $29. 22. 17 and change. She stopped buying hot food. She learned which gas stations kept microwaves near the coffee counter and which clerks looked away if a person warmed water in a paper cup. She kept the $10 bill separate. Once, after a night so cold she woke with her teeth aching, she took it from her sock and laid it on her knee. Alexander Hamilton looked back at her, engraved and patient. She folded the bill again. The classified ad appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in the Virginia Public Library, in a week when the sky had lowered so far the town seemed built inside a bowl. Sadie had gone there because the Buick would not start unless the temperature rose, and the library had radiators along the east wall. She sat beneath a framed photograph of miners from 1912 and opened a stack of local papers someone had left near the recycling bin. The ad was small, boxed in black, printed between an estate sale and a notice for snowmobile parts. St. Luskanky tax forfeit in structures. Sealed minimum bid sale. Non-habitable buildings. Removal or repair equal. Birch Narrows Canoe Works. Outbuilding only. Near Illy. MN. Minimum bid $10. ASIs. No. Buyer assumes all liquidity. Below that came a parcel number, an inspection date already passed, and the address of the Land and Minerals Department in Duluth. Someone had underlined the word demolition in red pencil. Perhaps the previous reader. Perhaps a clerk marking doomed things for disposal. Sadie read it once. Then again. Canoe Works. The words were ordinary and not ordinary. They seemed to lift from the page with the smell of wet cedar around them. She leaned closer, pressing one finger beneath the line as if the print might change if she did not hold it still. Birch Narrows meant nothing to her then. Ely meant cold lakes, outfitters, old mining houses, and the road north into the Boundary Waters, a place spoken of by customers at the diner with expensive boots and careful maps. But Canoe Works belonged to another language, one Arden had taught her in Winter Light. She asked the librarian for help finding county auction rules. The librarian was a narrow woman with silver hair pinned at the back and glasses hanging from a beaded chain. Her name tag read MRS. Cal Oliva. She did not ask why a girl with cracked lips and a garbage bag at her feet wanted tax-forfeited property forms. She printed 3 pages from the county website and slid them across the desk. "Deadline is Friday, Mrs." Kaleva said, "They will want the bid in writing." Sadie looked at the printout. "Can I mail it from here?" "You can. But if it were me, I would deliver it by hand. Winter mail has its moods." "Mrs." Kaleva paused, then reached beneath the counter and produced an envelope from a drawer. It was not new. One corner had softened. "This will do." At a table near the radiator, Sadie wrote her name in the careful block letters she used for job applications. She copied the parcel number 3 times before trusting it. Under bid amount, she wrote 10,000s, then stared at the number until it seemed both foolish and exact. She had no address suitable for a return line. After a long moment, she wrote General Delivery. Duluth, MN, because she had once seen those words on a form and understood they meant a person might still be reachable without being housed. When the form asked intended use, she stopped. Repair, she wrote. The word sat there alone, modest as a nail. She did not mail it. Mrs. Kaleva's warning had entered her bones. Instead, Sadie folded the form into the envelope and placed the $10 bill inside it. Then removed the bill again. County offices did not want cash loose in envelopes. The printed rules said, certified funds preferred, money order accepted, personal check accepted. She had no checkbook and no account, with enough left to matter. The librarian watched from the desk but did not interfere. A grocery down the street sold money orders. The fee was $1.25. Sadie counted coins under the fluorescent light while the cashier, a teenage boy with a pierced eyebrow and tired eyes, waited without comment. She used $10 for the bid and paid the fee from her remaining change. The money order came out pale and official, bearing her name in ink that looked more confident than she felt. By closing time, the envelope was sealed. Sadie slept that night in the library parking lot because the Buick had started after 3 attempts and she did not want to risk driving far. Snow tapped the roof in soft, patient grains. She held the sealed bid against her ribs beneath her coat and listened to the buildings settle after the lights went out. Somewhere beyond town, roads led north through timber, past frozen lakes and dark mailboxes, toward a shed condemned by men who had never put their hands to cedar. The next morning, she made her decision in small acts rather than one large one. She poured the last of her water into the radiator reservoir because the Buick had begun to steam. She cleaned the windshield with her sleeve. She threw away 2 receipts, kept 1 pencil, and tied Arden's broken paddle pattern to the inside of her suitcase with a shoelace so it would not bend further. She bought no breakfast. She spent $3 on gas, which moved the needle only enough to suggest mercy, and drove toward Duluth first because the bid had to be delivered there before any road could lead beyond it. At the county building, she stood in line behind a man paying taxes on timberland and a woman arguing about a plow assessment. The clerk behind the glass took the envelope, stamped it with the date, and dropped it into a gray bin without ceremony. Sadie wanted to ask whether anyone else had bid. She wanted to ask whether a person could buy a building without anywhere to sleep. She wanted to ask what happened if the roof was too far gone and the county changed its mind. Instead, she said, "Thank you." The clerk nodded toward the next person. For 2 days, nothing changed except the weather. Sadie drove when the car allowed it, parked where light made her less afraid, and checked general delivery with fingers so cold the postal worker told her to stand near the wall heater. On the third afternoon, an envelope waited for her. It bore the county seal and her name typed slightly crooked. The letter said her bid had been accepted. It also said the deed would need to be signed in person at the county clerk's office in Ely, where local transfer records were held for that parcel. There were fees waived due to demolition status, liabilities enclosed, no utilities guaranteed, no occupancy permitted until inspection, and a sentence warning that structures deemed unsafe could be removed at county discretion if repairs did not commence. Sadie read every word. Then she read the first sentence again, the one that said accepted, because a life can turn on a word without raising its voice. The Buick would not make Ely. She knew that before she tried. The engine had begun knocking with a hollow rhythm that seemed to come from deep beneath the hood, and the heater was dead, and one tire lost air if left overnight. She sold the car 2 days later to a salvage yard near Proctor for $120 cash, less than the tires were worth, more than nothing. The man at the yard let her sit in the office while he counted bills with blackened fingers. A calendar with hunting dogs hung above his desk. "You need a ride somewhere?" he asked. "Bus station," Sadie said. He looked at the suitcase, the trash bag, the rolled paddle pattern tied with string. Then he looked away, which was its own kind of kindness. The bus ticket north took more than she wanted to spend. Food would take more. Winter would take what it always took. But the envelope in her coat pocket had become heavier than fear, and the county's accepted bid gave her what no placement, no kitchen rule, no circled calendar payment had ever given. A place could be ruined and still be claimed. At dusk, Sadie stood beneath the depot light with her suitcase upright beside her, the trash bag at her feet, and Arden's broken pattern tucked under one arm. The bus idled in a cloud of diesel, its windows glowing with a yellow warmth she would only borrow for a few hours. North of Duluth, beyond the last familiar streets, a condemned shed waited in snow, with its roof torn open and its iron steam tube sealed in silence. The bus pulled away from Duluth before morning had decided what color it meant to be. Sadie sat halfway back on the right side, where the window seal leaked in a thin line and the heater under the seat gave off a smell of scorched lint. She kept her suitcase between her knees because the aisle was narrow, and the trash bag was tucked overhead among canvas duffels, plastic shopping sacks, and one cardboard box tied with twine. The broken paddle pattern lay flat against her chest inside her coat, not because it was warm there, but because she did not trust the luggage rack with anything that had survived so little. The road north took its time. At first there were gas stations, sleeping motels, tire shops, and fast food signs lit against the gray. Then the houses grew farther apart. The bus passed ditches packed to the shoulders with plow-thrown snow, black spruce crowding the right-of-way, and frozen marshes where cattails stood stiff and brown above the drifts. A man 2 rows ahead coughed into a handkerchief every few miles. Behind Sadie, a woman unwrapped a hard-boiled egg and salted it from a paper packet. No one spoke much. Winter had a way of making strangers decent by making everyone smaller. She counted towns by the sound of the brakes. Cloquet, Brookston. Cotton, then miles of timber and pale sky, the bus climbing and descending over country that seemed folded beneath the snow. At a stop where the driver stepped outside to smoke, Sadie checked the thermometer mounted near a bank sign across the road. It read 8 degrees below zero. The numbers looked clean and unreasonable. By late afternoon, the bus reached Virginia, where Sadie had to wait 2 hours for the connection east. She sat inside the station with her hands under her arms and watched a janitor push meltwater toward the door with a gray mop. A vending machine offered crackers, candy bars, and peanuts for more than she wished to pay. She bought nothing. Hunger had become something she could set on a shelf for later, if she handled it gently. The second bus was smaller and less heated. It carried a miner with a lunch pail, 2 women with grocery bags, an old man who smelled faintly of tobacco and cold wool, and Sadie. Snow began near Tower, moving across the windshield in narrow white lines as the sky fell early behind the trees. The driver kept one hand high on the wheel and leaned forward as though he could persuade the road to show itself sooner. Ely appeared after dark. Not all at once, and not as the destination she had imagined while reading the county letter. First came the faint glow above roofs, then a sign half buried in snow, then storefront windows, plowed banks, flags frozen in their brackets, and the slow grinding turn of the bus into a lot rimmed with dirty ice. Sadie stepped down with her suitcase and trash bag into air that entered the lungs like a blade washed clean. The clerk's office would not open until morning. She knew that from the folded letter, now softened at the creases from being read and handled. The motel across the road had a vacancy sign and warm curtains in every window, but Sadie did not cross toward it. She walked instead, because walking was free for as long as the body could bear it. A county map in the station had shown the parcel as roughly 4 miles out beyond town, maybe more depending on where the old road had been cut off. The clerk's directions would come later, but Sadie wanted to know the first part of the way. She followed Sheridan Street under lamps that made the snowbanks look blue. Her suitcase dragged poorly, its wheels collecting salt and ice until she had to lift it by the handle. The trash bag rubbed against her leg with each step. Past the last bright business, the town thinned. She walked along the shoulder until the lamps ended and the trees took over. Twice, headlights came toward her and she stepped into the snow to let trucks pass. The second driver slowed, then continued. She did not blame him. A young woman walking a road at night with a suitcase could be danger or trouble or only sorrow, and most people had enough of their own. After 2 miles, her hands had stopped hurting and become distant. After 3, the cold seemed to have moved inside the seams of her clothing. She found the hay barn by smell before sight, stood back from the road beside a fenced field. Its roof caved only at one corner, the open bay facing away from the wind. There were no animals, only square bales stacked along the inner wall and old machinery beneath a tarp hardened by frost. Sadie stood at the entrance for a long minute, listening. No dog barked. No porch light came on from the farmhouse far across the field. Snow whispered over the threshold. She went in. The thermometer later would say 13 below, according to the radio at the clerk's office, but in the barn the air felt older than any number. She made a nest between 2 stacks of hay, not deep enough to disturb the bales, just enough to cut the wind. She tucked her suitcase against one side and the trash bag against the other, then slid the paddle pattern beneath her coat again and curled around it. Mice moved somewhere above. A loose strip of tin clicked in the roof whenever the wind found the right angle. Sleep came in pieces. She woke to her own shaking, to the smell of hay dust, to the hard ache in her toes, to the darkness brightened now and then by passing headlights on the road. Once, near dawn, She heard coyotes across the field, their voices thin and separate, then joined in a pattern she could not read. She did not feel fear exactly. Fear required room. Cold had occupied most of it. When morning arrived, the world inside the barn turned gray before it turned visible. Sadie brushed hay from her coat, flexed her feet until pain returned, and stepped outside beneath a sky as white as unmarked paper. Her breath rose and vanished. She walked back toward town, with her suitcase held off the ground because its wheels had frozen in place. Ely received her without ceremony. Daylight showed what night had only suggested. There was a hardware store with green trim and a bell over the door. A cafe with steamed windows and hand-lettered pies listed on a board. An outfitter whose front window displayed snowshoes, paddles, wool socks, and maps of the boundary waters protected behind glass. A pharmacy with a red mortar and pestle sign swinging above a shoveled stoop. A small bank made of pale brick, its clock running 3 minutes slow. Farther down, a bait shop stood closed for the season. Minnow tanks drained, the painted fish on the sign half hidden by frost. Sadie noticed all 5 because places introduced themselves by what they tended. The hardware store tended repairs. The cafe tended hunger. The outfitter tended people who entered wild country by choice. The pharmacy tended the body. The bank tended numbers. She stood across from them with hay clinging to her hem and road salt dried white on her boots, and for a moment the whole town seemed arranged around needs she had been carrying in silence. A man in a red cap came out of the cafe with 2 paper cups and looked at her without staring. An older woman in a quilted coat unlocked the pharmacy door. A pickup backed slowly from a diagonal parking space, tires crunching over packed snow. Somewhere a dog barked once and gave up. The county clerk's office was in a modest municipal building set back from the street, not grand enough to frighten anyone, and not plain enough to be mistaken for private life. It had brick walls, a flagpole, a shoveled walk, and glass doors marked with office hours in white letters. Inside, heat struck Sadie's face so suddenly that her eyes watered. She wiped them with the heel of her hand and stood on a rubber mat while snow melted from her boots. The hallway smelled of floor wax, paper, and old radiators. A bulletin board held notices about snow emergency routes, dog licenses, water testing, a quilting circle at the community center, and a warning about thin ice on Burnside Lake. Someone had pinned a faded flyer for a lost gray cat, though the date was from September. Sadie read it because the office window was not yet open, and because waiting in public required a person to make herself harmless. At 9 exactly, a woman lifted the shade behind the counter. The clerk was in her late 60s, perhaps older, with hair the color of clean flour twisted into a low knot. She wore a dark green cardigan over a white blouse and had square hands with knuckles enlarged by work or weather. Her glasses hung from a chain but rested on her nose when she looked at papers. A brass nameplate on the counter read MRS. Elaine Rukavina. Scanty clerk, in letters polished by years of sleeves brushing past. She looked at Sadie's suitcase, the trash bag, the hay on her coat, and then at Sadie's face. "Morning," she said. "What can I do for you?" Sadie removed the county letter from inside her coat and unfolded it carefully. The paper had warmed against her and curled at the corners. "I am here about a deed transfer." Mrs. Rukavina took the letter. "Read the top half, then the lower half," then looked over her glasses. "For Birch Narrows." "Yes." "Mom!" The clerk did not move for a moment. Behind her, file cabinets stood in 2 ranks, each drawer labeled in black tape. A wall clock ticked with a dry, exact sound. Somewhere deeper in the building, a copier started, ran 3 sheets, and stopped. You are the bitter... Yes. Mom. Mrs. Rukavina set the paper down with a care that made it feel heavier. Do you have identification? Sadie handed over her state ID. The clerk compared the name, the birth date, the tired photograph, and the person standing before her. Then she nodded once and opened a drawer. This will take a few minutes. Sadie stood because no chair had been offered, and because sitting down with all her belongings around her felt like admitting something the room already knew. Mrs. Rukavina moved through the file cabinets with deliberate economy. Drawer. Folder. Ledger. Stamp pad. A packet bound with a metal clip. She did not hurry, but nothing in her wasted motion. When she returned, she laid the packet on the counter and placed both hands flat beside it. You understand, she said. This is not a residence. Yes. Mom. You understand the county has not certified the structure. Yes. Mom. You understand there is no power, no municipal water, and no heat. Yes. Mom. You understand the roof has failed in more than one location. Yes. Mom. You understand that if repairs do not begin, demolition can proceed. Yes. Mom. Mrs. Rukavina watched her through the lenses. And you understand that ownership means taxes, liability, and responsibility, not merely shelter. Sadie's throat moved before her voice did. Yes. Mom. The clerk's face changed by almost nothing. A slight settling around the mouth. A small release in the shoulders. It was not approval. It might have been recognition. Though of what, Sadie could not yet tell. There are people, Mrs. Rukavina said, turning one page toward her, who buy condemned structures because they think the county has hidden a bargain inside a warning. Mostly what they find is rot, raccoons, and invoices. Sadie looked at the page. I understand. There are also people who buy them because no one else has left them a door. The sentence rested there in the office air. Sadie did not answer. Her hands were rough from cold and work. The knuckles cracked open in two places. She placed them on the counter because hiding them seemed more dishonest than showing them. Mrs. Rukavina slid a pen toward her. Sign where I marked. The deed was longer than Sadie expected. Legal descriptions had a language like fences, full of section lines. Townships, rights reserved, easements, exceptions, and phrases that seemed designed to survive every person named in them. She wrote her signature where the clerk had placed blue tabs. She printed her name below. She initialed one warning page and another. She signed a demolition acknowledgement and an assumption of risk statement and a form confirming she had received no guarantee of habitability. Her handwriting grew steadier as the packet thinned. When it was done, Mrs. Rukavina aligned the pages by tapping them twice against the counter. She lifted a brass stamp from a black pad, pressed it to the deed with both hands, and the sound it made was not loud, but it carried a metal certainty, a county's small thunder. She stamped again on the transfer form, then signed her own name beneath the seal in blue ink. Recorded, she said. Sadie looked at the seal darkening on the paper. She had expected, foolishly perhaps, to feel some opening in the chest, some warmth equal to the stamp's authority. Instead, she felt only tiredness and the beginning of hunger returning from its shelf. Mrs. Rukavina placed the deed copy in a manila envelope and wrote the parcel number across the front. Then she reached for a local map, the folded kind given free to visitors who needed trails. Lakes, outfitters, and roads that did not always appear the same after snow. "You will take Sheridan East until it becomes Fernburg Road," she said, marking with a pencil. "At the old mile marker, you will see a logging cut on the right. It is not plowed. Follow it as far as you can. There used to be a spur, but the county stopped maintaining it when the last lease failed. The shed sits above a marshy inlet north of the old Narrows. Do not walk the ice unless you know it." "I do not know it." "Then do not—" "Yes." "Mom." "Mrs." Rukavina marked another place. "There is a neighbor half a mile before the cut. The Nystrom place. They have dogs. Stay on the road and let them bark. They are louder than their courage." Sadie nodded. "The property has no mailbox. No marked drive. The sign was still standing last time the assessor went out, but that was 4 years ago." She paused. "Maybe 5. The clerk folded the map and set it atop the deed envelope. Still, she did not release her hand from it. "Voss," she said, looking at the name she had written on the receipt. Sadie went still. "Mrs." Rukavina took off her glasses and let them hang from the chain. Without them, her eyes appeared paler, more tired, and more human. "There was a boatmaker by that name down by 2 Harbors. Came up here summers when my husband and I were young. Sold 1 canoe to my brother in 1979, and my brother treated that thing better than he treated his own truck." Sadie kept her hand on the counter. "He was my uncle." The clerk's expression did not soften quickly. It arrived there by careful degrees. "I wondered," she said. The office remained unchanged. The radiator hissed. The clock went on ticking. Papers lay in their piles, county business waiting with its usual patience. But something had moved beneath the surface, the way water moves under winter ice when no one can see the current. "He was exact, Mrs." Rukavina said. Sadie looked down. "Yes." "Quiet man." "Yes. Made a paddle once for the church auction. My husband said the blade was so thin at the edge you could read light through it." Sadie had no memory of that paddle, yet her hands remembered the kind of edge described. The careful thinning, the sanding through grits until the wood no longer felt worked, only revealed. "Mrs." Rukavina slid the map the rest of the way across. "Well," she said, and her voice returned to its official shape, though not entirely. "That shed belonged to a canoeman, too, long before the county got hold of it. Maybe that is nothing. Maybe it is not." Sadie folded the map once more and placed it inside her coat with the deed. "Thank you." The clerk reached beneath the counter and brought out a paper bag. It had the cafe's name stamped on one side in blue ink. Inside were 2 plain rolls and a wrapped square of butter. "I bought one too many, Mrs." Rukavina said. The statement was not convincing. It was also not to be challenged. Sadie accepted the bag with both hands. "Thank you. Mom." "Mrs." Rukavina looked toward the window, where the morning had brightened without warming. "You will want to start walking before noon." Sadie did. She left the municipal building with the deed against her ribs, the map folded in her pocket, the paper bag under one arm, and the suitcase bumping behind her. The town looked different now, though nothing in it had changed. The hardware store still had green trim. The cafe windows were still steamed. The outfitter still displayed maps of lakes she did not know. The pharmacy sign still swung faintly in the wind. The bank clock was now 4 minutes slow. She ate 1 roll while standing in the lee of the municipal building, spreading the butter with the edge of the paper it came wrapped in. She ate slowly because Mrs. Rukavina's kindness deserved not to be swallowed in panic. the second roll she saved. The paper bag she folded and placed into the outer pocket of her suitcase, because useful things were not to be thrown away merely because they had already served once. The walk began on cleared sidewalk and became road shoulder by degrees. Sheridan Street carried her past houses with snow piled to the lower windows, garages with antlers mounted above the doors, and yards where boats slept under tarps shaped by drifts. A school bus went by, chains ticking. A woman shoveling at the end of a driveway lifted one hand. Sadie lifted hers in return, the gesture awkward under the weight of her suitcase. At the town's edge, Fernburg Road took over. The land opened and closed around her. Spruce and birch crowded close, then fell back to reveal frozen lowlands, dark water channels, and ridges of stone shouldering through snow. Mailboxes appeared in clusters, then singly, then not at all. The road had been plowed, but the shoulders were uneven and treacherous, so she walked facing traffic, switching the suitcase from one hand to the other whenever her fingers cramped. A pickup slowed beside her after the first mile. The driver was a woman with a knit cap pulled low and a black dog sitting upright in the passenger seat. The dog fogged the glass with its breath. The woman lowered the window halfway. "You need a lift?" Sadie's answer rose from habit. "No. Thank you." The woman looked at the suitcase. Long way to be carrying that. "Yes, Mom." "Suit yourself," the woman said, not unkindly, and drove on. The offer stayed behind like a warm coal Sadie could not carry but was glad to have seen. Past the Nystrom place. The dogs announced her long before she reached the driveway. There were 3 of them, all large, all offended by the fact of her moving along the road. One was black with a white chest, one yellow and thick through the shoulders, one gray-muzzled and hopping on 3 legs. They ran to the edge of an invisible boundary and barked with professional commitment. Sadie remembered the clerk's warning and stayed on the far side. A man in a barn coat appeared near the garage and raised his hand, not in greeting exactly, more in acknowledgement that the dogs were doing what dogs did, and he would not permit more. Sadie nodded. The gray-muzzled dog stopped barking first. The yellow one continued until she was beyond the curve. After that, the road narrowed in spirit, though, not in measurement. Fewer tire tracks. More trees. More silence between passing vehicles. Sadie found the old mile marker half buried in snow. Its numbers rusted but still legible if a person leaned close. The logging cut on the right was hardly a road. Only a break in the snowbank where a path had once entered the timber and been abandoned to alder. Young birch, and whatever winter wished to cover. She stood at the entrance and looked down it. No plow had touched it. A pair of deer had crossed near the road. Rabbit tracks stitched the surface farther in. The trees leaned over it with the settled patience of things that had been reclaiming their own for a long time. Sadie lifted the suitcase and stepped into the cut. The snow came to mid-calf in places, higher where wind had carried it across the open spaces. The trash bag caught on brush until she stopped and retied it tighter. The suitcase had to be dragged, then carried, then dragged again. Each 100 yards became its own piece of labor. Her breath grew loud inside her scarf. Sweat cooled along her back whenever she paused, and the cold took advantage of every pause. The land dipped toward a marsh. She smelled it even under ice, a faint mineral wetness beneath snow and cedar. Tamaracks stood bare and fine against the sky, their branches holding small caps of white. Beyond them, through a screen of alder, she saw the dark line of water not fully frozen where current moved. The old Narrows, perhaps, or only a creek entering a lake. Names would come later. For now there was the sound of water under ice. Low and hidden, speaking in the patient language of thaw not yet due. Then she saw the walnut trees. They did not belong easily to the rest of the northern woods, 4 of them standing in a rough row near a rise above the marsh, their dark limbs wide and blunt against the winter sky. They had been planted by hands, long ago, when someone wanted shade, or nuts, or memory. Beneath them, half swallowed by snow, stood the shed. It was larger than the word had allowed her to imagine. Not a shack. Not a cottage. A working building, rectangular and narrow, perhaps 30 feet long and 18 wide, with weathered cedar siding gone silver in some places and black in others where water had lingered. The roof was steep, built for snow, but failed along the western slope where shingles had lifted and rotted through. One corner had sagged toward the earth, pulling the wall out of square so that the whole structure seemed to be listening with one shoulder lowered. A brick chimney rose near the center, capped badly with a rusted sheet of metal weighted by stones. Its upper courses were spalling, red faces popped by frost. Along the front, a wide double door hung from strap hinges. One leaf closed, the other bowed outward at the bottom. Beside it, a smaller human door leaned inward as if tired of standing. Above both doors, a sign remained, Birch Narrows Canoe Works. The paint had mostly gone. The letters showed not because they were bright, but because they had weathered differently from the board around them, patient ghosts of a trade left in weather. At the left edge of the sign was the carved outline of a canoe, long and low, the bow lifted slightly as if meeting a wave. Sadie stood beneath it until the suitcase handle cut into her palm. The building did not welcome her. It did not reject her either. It waited with the hard impartiality of wood, nails, snow, and time. That was enough. She found the smaller door frozen at the threshold. A drift had packed against it, then thawed and frozen again into a low white seal. She set down her belongings and kicked gently at the base, not wanting to split anything that might be needed later. The door did not move. She used the edge of the broken paddle pattern, then stopped at once, ashamed of the impulse. Instead, she found a fallen branch under one walnut tree and chipped at the ice until her wrists ached. The latch was a black thumb piece, stiff but not locked. On the 7th shove, the door opened inward 6 inches, then 12, then far enough for Sadie to slip through sideways with her coat scraping both jambs. Cold entered with her. So did daylight, thin and gray. The first smell was cedar. Not fresh cedar. Not the clean sweetness of a new shaving curling from a blade. This was older, buried under dust. Mouse nesting, damp plaster, iron rust, and the faint sourness of long-closed rooms. But cedar remained. It rose from boards, forms, scrap, and perhaps memory itself, and Sadie stood inside the doorway with one hand on the frame while the smell moved through her like a hand laid between the shoulders. The front room had once been a place for work seen by customers. There was a counter along the right wall, its surface gouged by use and stained by rings where cans had stood. Shelves behind it held empty jars, 2 cracked lantern chimneys, a box of brass tacks gone green, and a stack of folded papers too mouse-chewed to trust. On the left, 3 canoe forms rested upside down on wooden horses, their ribs exposed like the bones of sleeping animals. Snow had blown through the roof seam and gathered in a long drift down the center of the floor. The floor itself was plank, wide and uneven, white pine darkened by age and water. In places it held. In others it dipped under Sadie's weight with a complaint that made her step back and choose another board. She learned quickly to keep near the walls until she knew more. A raccoon had left prints in the dust near the counter. Mice had made fine black punctuation along the shelves. The front windows were filmed white at the edges, one pane cracked from corner to corner. She brought in her suitcase first, then the trash bag, then stood with the door open while her eyes adjusted. The back room lay beyond a partition of vertical boards. Its doorway had no door. She crossed carefully, 1 foot testing each place before committing weight. The air changed in the back, colder and more metallic. There the real shop had been. A long bench ran beneath a row of windows facing the marsh. Clamps hung from nails in graduated sizes. A shaving horse sat near the center, one leg repaired with a different wood. There were racks for long stock, mostly empty, and a wall of forms marked by pencil numbers, some still legible, some blurred by damp. Against the far wall rested the steam-bending tube. It was larger than the one she remembered from childhood. Cast iron, black with age, mounted on 2 heavy brackets fixed into a timber frame. One capped end faced the room, bolted shut with a ring of rusted nuts. The other end disappeared behind a plank housing where a boiler once must have attached. A sagging length of pipe led toward the chimney wall. Beneath it, the floor was stained dark in a long oval, old water and heat having left their record in the boards. Sadie did not go near it at first. Some objects ask to be approached after a person has earned the room around them. She explored instead with slow attention. A washstand held an enamel basin cracked through the bottom. A broom, handle broken short, leaned in the corner. There was a crate of cedar scraps too damp to burn, a pair of leather gloves stiff as bark, a rusted draw knife with one handle missing, and a calendar from 1987 still pinned beside the back door, February visible beneath a curled page. On the calendar, someone had circled a 12th in pencil. No note explained why. The back door opened to a narrow stoop overgrown by snow. Beyond it, the marsh and water lay under the low evening sky. The day had already begun to withdraw. Sadie had spent most of it walking, signing, listening, and entering, and now the consequences of arrival gathered around her. There was no bed, no stove ready to light, no water except snow, no certainty that the roof would hold if the wind shifted. She returned to the front room and closed the smaller door as well as the warped frame allowed. A gap remained along the bottom, so she rolled the trash bag, still half filled with clothes, against it to stop the draft. From her suitcase she removed the diner sweater, a second pair of socks, the paper bag with the saved roll, and the envelope containing the deed. She ate the roll in small bites while standing, because sitting down too soon might make rising feel impossible. The light fell. Without electricity, evening entered completely and without negotiation. The shed's interior became shapes, then darker shapes, and then only the pale lines of windows and the snowdrift under the roof seam. Sadie found the cracked lantern chimney, but no lamp oil. She had one book of matches from a gas station and no fire she trusted yet. The chimney had not been cleaned. The stove, if there was one, remained hidden under a sheet of tin and fallen plaster near the back wall. Fire used badly could take the only roof she had just claimed. So she made a place on the floor in the front room where the boards felt firmest. She spread the wool blanket first, then her coat, then changed socks with fingers clumsy from cold. The dry pair felt like a blessing too plain to name. She put the deed envelope inside her suitcase, then reconsidered and placed it beneath the blanket, near her hip. Papers could vanish. Deeds could be mislaid. She had lived among adults who believed possession belonged to whoever could take and explain afterward. The building settled around her. There were sounds, many of them. Snow sliding somewhere overhead. A drip that struck metal at long intervals. Mice within a wall. wind moving through the roof seam and traveling down the room like breath across a bottle. Once, something larger moved outside near the walnut trees, breaking crusted snow in 3 slow steps before silence returned. Sadie lay still and let each sound declare itself. The floor smelled of dust and cedar. The blanket smelled of car vinyl, hay, and her own skin. Her breath warmed the scarf over her mouth until it dampened, then chilled. She tucked her hands into her armpits and drew her knees close, trying to make one compact shelter of the body. Above her, rafters crossed in darkness. Beyond them, through the torn roof, she could see a narrow line of sky and one star, exact and distant. She did not pray in words. Words had too often been used around her as decoration, excuse, or receipt. Instead, she laid one hand flat on the floorboards and kept it there. The boards were cold. They were real. Under her palm ran the grain of a tree cut long before she was born, laid down by someone who had expected work to continue in this room. That expectation remained, though everything else had failed around it. Near midnight, the wind changed. The gap under the door sighed. The sign outside creaked on its fastenings. The shed answered with a low sound from deep in its frame. Not collapse. Not speech. Something between a groan and a settling into itself. Sadie opened her eyes in the dark. She listened until the sound passed and did not return. For the first time since her birthday, no one could tell her to leave before morning. That fact did not warm the room. It did not mend the roof or fill her stomach or make the floor softer beneath her shoulder. It did not remove the county warnings or make the winter kind. Still, it stood in the dark with more authority than any promise she had been given. Sadie slept at last in short, careful stretches, one hand still touching the floor. The shed was not empty. It had been waiting. By first light, Sadie had learned that the floor near the front counter complained in 3 different voices. The board closest to the door gave a dry tick under the heel. The second plank, darker than the others, bowed with a soft breath as if air were trapped beneath it. The third, where snowmelt had darkened the grain into a long stain, answered wait with a low, dangerous note that made her step away at once. She did not know yet which supports had failed below, or whether a joist had rotted at the sill, but she understood the warning well enough. A house, like a person, gave signs before breaking if anyone cared to listen. She spent the first morning making a map of where she could place her feet. With a pencil from her coat pocket, she marked the unsafe boards with little X's near the edges where the wood had already split. She did not write on any surface that seemed sound. The marks were not meant to last. They were a temporary language between her body and the building, careful enough to keep her alive until she could learn more. By noon, she could cross from the front door to the back bench without guessing. By evening, she could do it in dim light. Water came next. There was a hand pump behind the shed, half hidden beneath a drift at the edge of the walnut trees. Sadie found it only because the pipe rose in a straight line where nothing natural would have chosen to stand. The handle was iron, flaked and frozen, its base crusted with ice and the brown husks of last autumn's leaves. She cleared snow with a broken cedar strip, then wrapped the handle in her scarf and tried to move it. Nothing. She waited, breathing into her sleeves, then tried again. The pump gave a slight shift, the kind of movement that could be mistaken for hope. She found a dented kettle in the back room, packed it with snow, and carried it inside to set near the place where a stove might one day work. With no fire yet, snow could only become water if she held it near her body or placed it in the thin afternoon sun that came through the south window. Both took too long. Still, by evening she had half a cup, cloudy with roof dust, which she strained through a clean corner of her shirt before drinking. On the second morning, she returned to the pump with a different patience. She had found a jar of mineral oil on a shelf behind the counter, separated and thickened, but not entirely useless. She worked a little around the pin, waited, moved the handle, worked more, waited again. The metal protested. Her fingers went numb. Twice she had to put her hands beneath her coat and press them against her ribs until pain returned. Then, after an hour, the handle came down halfway with a groan so deep it seemed to rise from the buried pipe itself. The first water came brown. It coughed from the spout in short, ugly bursts, full of rust and grit, and splashed into the enamel basin she had dragged outside. Sadie pumped until her shoulders burned. Brown became amber. Amber became pale yellow. At last, near noon, the water ran clear enough to catch the sky in it. She did not trust it yet. She filled the kettle anyway and set it aside, because a clear thing still needed boiling, and boiling still required a chimney that would not send poison back into the room. The outhouse stood beyond the walnut trees, tilted under a young spruce that had grown too close to its wall. Its door hung from one hinge and had been tied shut with baling twine long since stiffened by weather. Sadie approached it with a cedar pole in hand, not because she expected danger exactly, but because abandoned places often held surprises with teeth or wings. Inside, the seatboard had cracked, the roof leaked, and a nest of dry grass filled one corner. There were no animals present, only evidence. She cleared what she could, fixed the door with wire taken from a bundle under the workbench, and marked in her mind that lime would be needed, along with new boards, a latch, and courage on cold mornings. By the third day, she knew which cracks in the walls admitted wind from the marsh and which from the road. She knew that sunlight entered the back room at an angle just after 10, touched the steam tube for 14 minutes, and then moved across the bench. She knew the mice kept mainly to the upper shelves if she stored food in the suitcase and closed it with a stone on top. She knew the roof seam would drip only when the day warmed above 10 degrees, and that the chimney corner smelled worse in late afternoon, as if damp brick released what it had been holding since morning. She made lists because lists did not pity her. Roof, chimney, floor, door, water, heat, food, work. The words filled half a page. Under each, she wrote what she could see, not what she feared. Missing shingles, failed flashing, spalled brick, creosote unknown, soft planks, north sill suspect, front latch bent, pump needs priming, no stovepipe visible, no dry fuel, cash remaining, not enough. She had money from selling the Buick, less the bus ticket, gas, food, and the small expenses that had followed her north like burrs. It would not repair a roof. It would not hire a carpenter. It would not buy safety outright. But it could begin. On the fourth morning, she walked back to town. The air was 12 below when she left. According to the thermometer nailed outside the Nystrom barn, and the road had hardened overnight until tire tracks shone like glazed pottery. She carried the folded county map, a list written on the back of a receipt, and the empty paper bag from the clerk's rolls, saved in case something needed carrying. Her hands ached before she reached Fernberg Road. By the time storefronts appeared, her scarf had frozen where breath had dampened it. The hardware store bell rang above her with a sound so bright it startled her. Inside, the place was narrow and deep, built in the manner of stores that had been added to rather than designed. The front held snow shovels, ice melt, kerosene cans, mouse traps, batteries, and a rack of wool gloves. Farther in were bins of bolts, drawers of brass screws, stacks of stovepipe, coils of rope, panes of glass stored upright in a wooden rack, and shelves of paint cans arranged by usefulness more than color. The air smelled of metal, dust, oiled wood, coffee, and the faint sharpness of turpentine. A black cat slept on a folded tarp near the register. Behind the counter stood a man in his 70s with one shoulder higher than the other, and a white mustache trimmed so precisely it seemed to belong to a different, more formal age. He wore a flannel shirt under brown suspenders, and a carpenter's pencil was tucked behind his right ear. His fingers were broad, flattened slightly at the tips, with dark half-moons under the nails no amount of washing had erased. He looked at Sadie's list before he looked fully at Sadie. "You are the Voss girl who bought Birch Narrows." It was not a question, but it was not accusation either. Sadie folded her hands around the list. "Yes, sir." "Thought so." Elaine said somebody might come in needing things in the wrong order. Sadie did not know what that meant, so she waited. The man reached for a mug near the register, drank coffee that must have gone cold, and set it down. "Name is Harlan Steger. Store's mine if the bank and the taxman are in a generous mood." He held out his hand. Sadie shook it. His grip was dry and careful, adjusted to the condition of her cracked knuckles before she had to ask. "What are you trying to do first?" he said. "Clean the chimney enough to know if I can use the stove. Patch the door gaps. Keep water off the worst part of the floor. Then roof, if I can." That is not the wrong order. He took the list and read it in silence. Once, he crossed out a word and replaced it with another. Not caulk. Baccarod first. Not tar. Roof cement only as temporary. Not nails. Any nails. Galvanized roofing nails. 1 1/4 inch. His pencil moved with such certainty that Sadie felt, for the first time in days, that repair might have a grammar. "You have tools?" he asked. "Some inside the shed. Mostly rusted." "Ladder?" "No." "Chimney No." "Stovepipe brush?" "No." Sadie looked at the counter. Harlan gave a short nod, as if that had been the answer expected. He opened a drawer beneath the register and pulled out a lined index card. "I run accounts for people who pay when they can and do not lie when they cannot. Elaine says your deed is recorded. That makes you local enough to owe me properly." Sadie lifted her head. "I can pay some now." "You will pay some now, and I will write the rest down. If you run, I will have a poor opinion of you, which is worth less than the debt but lasts longer." The cat opened one eye, decided nothing of interest was happening, and slept again. Sadie removed her wallet. "I do not want charity." "Good. This is credit. I do not know when I can." "Then do not promise a date. Promise a practice." She looked at him. "Come in when you can," Harlan said. "Pay what you can. Tell the truth about the rest." Sadie placed bills on the counter. He counted them without comment, wrote the amount at the top of the card, then wrote her name. After a moment, he added Birch Narrows beneath it. From a lower shelf, he pulled a book with a torn blue cover and pages swollen by years in a damp basement. The title read Basic Home Repair for Northern Cabins. Someone had written H. Cedar. 1964 inside the front cover. "This is not for sale," he said. It is to come back. Sadie took it with both hands. Chapter 4 for chimney inspection. Chapter 7 for temporary roof covers. Ignore the wiring chapter. It will get you killed. Read twice before you touch anything. 3 times if you are tired. Yes, sir. He began laying items on the counter. A 6-inch round chimney brush with poly bristles. Used but sound. $12 if new, $4 on loan if returned. 2 fiberglass rods, 3 feet each. Cracked near the threads. No charge if she did not force them. A flat wire brush, $2.25. A cold chisel, $3. Work gloves from the bargain bin, $1. A dust mask, 69 cents. A bundle of shop rags, $1.50. A small tub of furnace cement, $4.89. Stove polish she did not need yet. Crossed off. A roll of foil tape, left on the shelf because he said it made fools confident. For the door gaps, 10 feet of cotton rope gasket, $2.10. 2 wooden shims, free from a coffee can. 1 hasp, used, 80 cents. Screws, 12 cents each, 6 needed. For the roof, temporary only, a remnant of heavy tarp, 6 by 8 feet, $3. Roofing nails, sold by weight, 1 pound for $2.30. A handful of fender washers from a bin, 24 cents. Not enough to fix the roof, but enough to persuade one leak to choose another path. Sadie wrote each price as he said it. Harlan watched approvingly. Numbers keep a person honest. Yes, also keep a person from despairing too broadly. That sentence stayed with her. He found a child's red sled in the back, cracked along one edge but still able to slide. You can drag this. Bring it back when you come again. The sled turned the walk home from impossible to merely difficult. She tied the supplies with rope Harlan had given her from a tangled box marked odds and pulled them over the packed shoulder until the town withdrew behind her. At the Nystrom place, the dogs came out to deliver their report. The gray-muzzled one barked twice, then seemed to remember her and stood watching instead. By late afternoon she was back at the shed, hands shaking from fatigue, legs wet to the knees. She did not begin work immediately. Harlan's rule had entered her with the weight of law. She sat on the firm floor near the window and read Chapter 4 while the light faded, turning each swollen page carefully. Chimneys, the book said, should be inspected from top and bottom. Creosote may appear as soot, tar glaze, or brittle deposits. A block flue can force smoke and carbon monoxide indoors. Birds, squirrels, collapsed brick, leaves, and loose mortar must be cleared before use. Wear eye protection if available. Seal openings. Work slowly. Do not assume. She read it twice that night by the weak light that entered from snow and sky. The next morning, she read it a third time. The stove turned out to be beneath the fallen plaster, as she had hoped and feared. It was a box stove, cast iron, with a cracked mica window and a stovepipe that rose 6 feet before entering the chimney thimble. Someone had stuffed a rag around the pipe joint long ago. The rag crumbled when Sadie touched it. She removed the pipe in sections, marking their order with chalk from a drawer, then carried each piece outside and tapped it with the wooden handle of the wire brush. Black flakes fell onto the snow. Inside the pipe, creosote had built-in ridges, glossy in places, rough in others. She brushed until her arms burned, rotating the brush with short strokes instead of forcing it through. The dust mask helped little. Soot found the edges of her face, the folds of her sleeves, the half-moons of her nails. She cleaned each section, inspected for holes, and set the usable pieces aside. The chimney itself took longer. She tied a rag over her hair, wrapped another around her mouth beneath the mask, and spread the tarp remnant beneath the thimble opening to catch falling debris. From below, she pushed the brush up with the rods, one length at a time, twisting clockwise so the threads would not loosen. The first shower of soot came down hard enough to make her step back. It struck the tarp like black sand. Then came flakes the size of coins. Then a dead nest of twigs, grass, and feathers compacted into a dry fist. She worked for 6 hours that day. Not 6 brave hours. 6 clumsy, interrupted, coughing hours, broken by trips outside to breathe and by moments when her hands trembled too badly to thread the rod. Twice the brush stuck. The first time she panicked and pulled, then stopped before she snapped it. Pressure asked. Force broke. She turned the rod gently, lowered a little, lifted again, and felt the obstruction give. The second time she rested her forehead against the wall until her breathing steadied, then began again. At dusk, she had filled half a bucket with creosote, soot, nest debris, and fragments of mortar. The next day she climbed. There was no proper ladder, but behind the shed she found a timber rack, fallen but usable, and used it to reach the lower roof over the back room. She moved as though the air itself might crack. The roof was treacherous, snow crust over rotten shingles, and she did not trust it enough to stand where she could not see rafters beneath. She crawled, distributing weight on hands and knees, and reached the chimney with the brush tied to a rope she had plaited from cord found in the shop. The cap was worse than it looked from below. Rusted sheet metal, 2 stones, wire twisted into a knot, all frozen together. She worked the wire loose with a cold chisel and a borrowed hammer, striking only when she had room. The cap came free suddenly and slid, but she caught it against her boot before it went over the edge. Beneath it, the top flue was narrowed by more soot and a wedge of crumbled brick. She cleared what she could by hand, wearing Harlan's gloves, then lowered the brush from above and pulled it through in long, even passes. By the time she climbed down, her coat was black at the elbows and knees. She did not light a fire that day. The book said to inspect again after cleaning. She obeyed. From inside, she held a shard of mirror behind the thimble opening and angled daylight down from the top with the cap removed. It was not perfect, but she could see a pale square above. Open. Damaged, but open. The furnace cement sealed 2 small gaps at the stove collar. She fitted the pipe back in order, crimped ends down so creosote would remain inside rather than leak at the joints, then packed the thimble gap with proper care instead of the dead rag. She had no new pipe, no perfect damper, no inspection certificate, but she had done what could be done by hand, book, and honesty. The first fire began with shavings no larger than curled fingernails. Sadie used only dry cedar scrap from the highest rack, testing each piece against her cheek for dampness the way Arden had taught her. She opened the draft. She warmed the flue by burning a twist of newspaper at the mouth of the stove and watching whether smoke climbed or rolled. It climbed reluctantly, then steadily. She laid shavings, then splinters, then 2 pieces no thicker than her thumb. When the match touched paper, flame took with a modest sound. She crouched on the floor and watched the smoke. A thin line escaped the stove door at first, then drew inward as the chimney found its pull. The pipe ticked as it warmed. The stove gave off a smell of hot iron, old ash, and dust-waking after years of cold. Sadie kept one hand near the door latch, ready to kill the fire if smoke reversed. It did not. Heat came slowly, almost shyly. It did not fill the shed. It did not drive winter from the corners. But it made a circle large enough for one person. One kettle, and one careful breath. Sadie sat near it and held her hands open. The cracks across her knuckles reddened. Her palms stung. She let them. For her first hot meal, she boiled pump water for 10 minutes in the dented kettle, then cooked oatmeal in an enamel cup with a bent handle. The oats had come from Harlan's store, marked down because the box was torn. She stirred with a cedar sliver shaved clean, added a pinch of salt from a paper packet saved from the bus station, and ate slowly while sitting on the floor beside the stove. The meal had no butter, no sugar, no milk. It was plain and thick and slightly smoky from the cup. She closed her eyes after the first spoonful, not from pleasure alone, but because heat inside the body was different from heat against the skin. It moved outward. It made a claim. It told the hands they might yet work and the feet they might yet bear weight. That evening, when the fire settled into coals, Sadie placed 3 cedar scraps beside the stove for morning and banked the ashes as best she could. The shed changed after that. Not in appearance. The roof still failed. The walls still admitted wind. Snow still lay in the center drift, and the floor still held its warnings. But a clean chimney and a working stove altered the order of labor. Mornings could begin with boiled water. Evenings could end with socks drying on a line tied between 2 nails. Her pencil list grew more exact, less desperate. On the 7th day, she began inventorying the workroom. She did it as if making a census of survivors. On the north wall, 7 clamps usable, 4 seized, 2 broken beyond repair, 1 with a maker's mark stamped faintly into the screw, 3 paddle blanks, warped but perhaps practice-worthy, 1 rack of ash strips too brittle for bending, 2 cedar planks under a tarp, damp at the ends, maybe salvageable if cut short, a box of copper canoe tacks, most green at the heads but sound beneath the corrosion, a tin of brass screws, sizes mixed, 1 sharpening stone cracked in half, 1 oil can empty, 1 roll of cotton canvas stiff with age, 1 jar of varnish turned to amberstone. On the bench, a wooden mallet with a split head, a crooked marking gauge, a spoke shave blade with no body, 2 awls, 1 bent, a hand plane missing its iron, a scraper burnisher, surprisingly clean, patterns hung by pegs, labeled in faded pencil, stem form A, thwart, seat frame, bow deck. Some labels were written by different hands. Some letters slanted left. Some stood upright. Some had the careful schoolhouse shape of an earlier century. On the high shelf above the windows, bundles wrapped in oilcloth, too stiff to open without warmth. A canvas sack of cane for seating, dry but not powdered. A cigar box full of clinching irons. A stack of notebooks eaten along the corners by mice, their pages mostly blank order forms from the 1970s. A ledger too water-damaged to read except for names. Dates, and prices that had bled into one another like shorelines on wet paper. She wrote everything down. Not because she owned it, though legally now she did, but because neglect had already erased so much. Naming was a way of keeping what remained from falling farther away. The steam tube waited while she worked around it. For 2 days. She avoided touching the bolted cap except to wipe dust from its rim. It dominated the far wall with a practical authority no decorative object could have possessed. Cast iron, 8 feet long, perhaps 20 inches in diameter, supported by two brackets that had been forged or fabricated for that purpose alone. The tube had a seam along its underside and a drain valve near one end, frozen open. Its surface held layers of soot, rust, and something waxy where hands had gripped it over decades. On the third inventory day, she tested it. She did not know why. Perhaps because every other object had answered when counted, and this one remained silent. Perhaps because the sunlight had reached it again for those 14 minutes and revealed a circular grain pattern near the capped end where no grain should have been. Perhaps because Arden's tube had rung when tapped, iron answering iron with a dull. Known music, and this one did not sound right. Sadie took the small hammer from the chimney work and struck the side lightly. The tube answered with a deep, hollow note. She moved 6 inches and struck again. Hollow. Another 6 inches. Hollow, but lower. Near the capped end, the sound changed. Not full. Not empty. The hammer gave a short, dead click, as if the iron backed onto something dense. She tapped above, below, around the cap, then along the seam. The same deadness returned at one quadrant only, a patch roughly the size of a dinner plate. She marked its outline with chalk. Then she stepped back. A cast iron tube could have scale inside. It could hold collapsed debris. It could contain a bird's nest, a wad of rags, a century of rust. But this sound was not random. It had edges. She tested weight next. The tube should have been too heavy to move, and it was. But when she slipped a pry bar under the capped end and pressed down, the bracket shifted slightly against the wall. Not much. Enough. The left side lifted with a reluctance that felt uneven, as if something inside had settled toward the cap. She wedged a block beneath the bracket, then removed it at once, uneasy about stressing iron that might crack if mishandled. The bolts around the cap were rusted but not fused. That was the next fact. Someone had oiled them once, long after the tube had been installed. The nuts carried rust on their faces, but the threads beneath showed a dark, greasy residue when she scraped with an awl. Sadie sat on an overturned crate and looked at the ring of bolts until evening settled over the windows. She waited until morning. Good work did not begin at the end of a tired day, especially work that asked old metal to forgive disturbance. She warmed the room first. Not hot, only above freezing. She set the kettle on the stove, poured a little hot water into a rag, and wrapped the first nut to soften what old oil might remain. Then she used mineral oil, a wire brush, and the patience of a person who had learned not to expect anything to yield quickly. The first nut turned after 40 minutes. Not easily. It moved one fraction, stopped. Moved back, moved forward again. Sadie worked it the way Arden had taught stuck clamps, never forcing a full turn when a quarter would do. By noon, she had loosened 3. By dark, 5. There were 12 in all. It took 2 days. On the second evening, with every nut removed and placed in order on a rag, the cap still would not come free. She tapped around the rim with the wooden mallet. Nothing. She slipped the edge of the cold chisel into the seam and felt for give. The seal cracked with a sound so soft she might have missed it if the shed had not been still. Air came out first. Not a gust. A breath. Dry, faintly cedar-scented, and touched with iron. Behind the cap was not the open throat of the tube. There was a disc of cedar fitted precisely inside the iron, darkened with age but not rotted. Its face had been rubbed with wax or resin, and at its center was a carved mark, a long canoe shape crossed by 3 short lines, like ribs or water. Around the edge, someone had driven small brass pins flush with the surface, pinning the disc to an inner lip. Sadie sat back on her heels. Her hands were black with oil. A line of soot marked one cheek. The room was cooling because she had let the fire go low while working, and yet she did not move to feed it. The cedar disc was not part of any repair she knew. It was not a plug made by neglect. It was fitted, deliberate, exact. She removed the brass pins one by one with the bent awl and a pair of pliers. 2 broke. 3 came free. The last held until she warmed it with a cloth dipped in hot water and pressed around the wood with her thumb. When the pins were out, she tried to lift the disc. It did not move. She found, near the bottom edge, a narrow notch barely wide enough for a blade. Into it she placed the tip of the awl and eased. The disc came forward half an inch. Cedar scent entered the room so cleanly that for one moment she was 14 again in Arden's shop, cocoa cooling beside the bench, steam breathing from iron, shavings bright as curls of butter under the window. She closed her eyes only long enough to steady her hands. Behind the disc lay a compartment. The interior had been lined with tin or zinc, now dull but intact, making a dry chamber inside the steam tube's dead end. Within it were packages wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cotton cord, stacked carefully to use the curve of the tube. There were 4 long bundles, 2 flat parcels, 1 roll of thin cedar strips bound with blue tape, and at the back, nearly beyond reach, a rectangular tin box with a soldered seam and a small leather handle folded against its lid. Sadie did not pull everything out at once. She cleared the bench. She spread the cleanest rag she owned. She washed her hands in boiled water, dried them, then returned to the tube and removed the first long bundle with both hands. It was heavier than cedar should be. She laid it on the rag, untied the cord, unfolded the oilcloth 1 flap at a time, and found a draw knife. Not Arden's. Older. Its handles were maple, dark from use, one worn slightly smaller where a right hand had held it through years of pulling. The blade had been oiled before storage and wrapped in waxed paper beneath the cloth. Along the steel, faint but legible, was stamped a maker's name from Duluth and a date 1911. The second bundle held a crooked knife with a curved blade and a handle carved to fit a palm. The third held 2 spoke shaves, 1 flat-bottomed, 1 round, both sharpened and protected. The fourth contained a slender froe, a small adze head wrapped separately from its handle, and a burnisher made from polished antler. Sadie laid them in a row. Heirloom tools did not look noble when first unwrapped. They looked practical, hand-worn, and almost stern. Their beauty was in the places use had altered them. The hollow where a thumb had rested. The polish at a grip. The dark line where steel met wood and had been cleaned after work instead of left to decay. She touched each tool lightly. Not with possession, but with greeting. The flat parcels came next. One held patterns, not paper but thin cedar templates, each marked with ink and sealed against damp. R.E.B. Set, North Lake Mortal. Thwart Curve, Narrows 12. Stem Payar, Winter Cut Ash. The handwriting was not Arden's, though something in its care reminded her of him. The second parcel held notebooks wrapped in waxed canvas, their covers marbled black and green, edges unchewed, pages dry. Sadie did not open them past the first page. Technical notes filled the lines in a hand small and disciplined. The cedar strips bound with blue tape were not structural pieces. They were samples, each one shaved thin and labeled by source, year, and behavior under steam. Red cedar, split 1934, bends at 28 minutes. White cedar, Winterfeld, 1942, check at sharp radius. Ash, soaked 3 days. Steam 42 minutes. Hold under clamp overnight. She read only a few labels before setting them aside. Then came the tin box. It was wedged at the back of the compartment, and her arm barely reached it. She used the leather handle, afraid it would tear. But it held. The box scraped softly against the metal lining as it came forward. It was heavier than anything else. Heavier than tools. Heavier than notebooks. Heavier in the way a thing is when its contents do not shift much because they have been packed tight. The lid had been sealed with a band of waxed cloth and tied with string. Under the string was a folded paper, not a letter exactly, more like an instruction in a firm hand. For the one who opens this after we are gone. Read only when you have made a fire and closed the door. Sadie stopped there. The room was not warm. The door did not close well. The roof still admitted a line of snow. The instruction was simple, and because it was simple, she obeyed it. She set the folded paper aside without reading further, though every part of her life had trained her to seize whatever knowledge might protect her before it vanished. The tin box still had to be opened. Its latch was stiff but not locked. Inside were layers. The top layer held cloth, folded over and over. Beneath it lay envelopes wrapped in butcher paper, each banded with cotton string and labeled by year. Notebooks, perhaps. Receipts. Route records. She lifted one enough to see the words Water Road Ledger on its face and put it back. Along one side stood a roll of canvas containing maps, their edges browned but dry. Beneath the maps were 2 bank envelopes, a leather pouch, and a small velvet-covered case faded to the color of dried blood. Sadie opened the bank envelopes first because paper money, if present, was both fragile and dangerous to leave unknown. The bills were mostly older issues, arranged by denomination and wrapped in paper bands. 20s, 50s, hundreds. Some were silver certificates. Some were Federal Reserve notes from years she had seen only in library exhibits. Each band had been counted and labeled in pencil. She did not trust the labels. She counted anyway. She counted on the bench with the stove door open enough to give light, then closed it when an ember shifted. 100, 500, 1,000. She wrote each stack in her notebook. Her hands began to shake, so she stopped and drank water. Then she counted again. The second count matched the first. She moved to the next envelope. Then the next. At some point, the room around her lost its edges. Not because she was dreaming, but because exact numbers require their own kind of silence. When she finished, the total came to $45,000.73. The cents were in the leather pouch. 31 wheat pennies, 7 mercury dimes, 4 silver quarters worn nearly smooth, 1 standing Liberty quarter with the date almost gone, 2 buffalo nickels, a Canadian dime from 1936, and, wrapped separately in tissue, an 1878 Morgan silver dollar rubbed bright at the cheek, as if many thumbs had crossed it before it had been put away. Sadie did not smile. Money that large did not feel like freedom at first. It felt like danger. It felt like adults with papers, doors that could be opened by strangers, questions she could not answer, hands reaching into what she had not yet understood. She sat very still and listened to the stove tick. The bills lay in stacks before her, more cash than she had ever seen outside a bank drawer or a television screen, and every stack seemed to ask what kind of person she would become if she let panic or hunger answer first. She gathered the bills back into their envelopes and retied the bands. Only then did she open the velvet case. Inside lay a military medal on a faded ribbon, bronze darkened with time, its surface bearing the profile and words she recognized only partly. The accompanying card was written in ink browned at the edges. Purple Heart. Awarded posthumously. 1944. France. Sadie held the case in both hands until the meaning reached her, without explanation. A life had been cut away from this family before the tools were hidden, before the cash was counted into envelopes, before the notebooks were sealed in oilcloth. Someone had kept the medal not as display, but as witness. She closed the case and placed it beside the tools. At the bottom of the tin box lay a long, narrow notebook bound in black cloth and a packet of folded papers tied with blue thread. The top paper bore the same instruction as before, but this time she saw the opening line beneath it. My dear one, whoever you are. Sadie turned the paper face down. Not yet. The instruction had said fire and closed door. She had fire, but the door was still warped. She had heat, but not enough. More than that, she sensed, in the careful packing, the polished tools, the money counted by year, the metal kept beside the maps, that whatever had been written deserved a morning mind and washed hands. It deserved not to be read while soot darkened her sleeves and hunger made every sentence serve immediate need. She closed the tin box without latching it. Then she did a strange and necessary thing. She returned most of the money to the box, returned the box to the lined compartment, slid the cedar disc back loosely without pins, and set one heavy clamp against it. Not hidden as before. Not open either. The shed knew. She knew. That was enough for one night. The notebooks and tools she kept on the bench, covered with oilcloth. Outside, the day had gone blue. Sadie put on her coat and stepped through the back door, pulling it shut as well as it would allow. The cold took her face in both hands. She walked past the pump, past the leaning outhouse, past the walnut trees, down toward the marsh where water moved under ice with a low, patient murmur. The sky held no sunset, only a pale weakening behind clouds. Tamarack branches stitched black lines against the snow. She stood at the edge of the frozen inlet and watched the one place where current kept the surface open. Dark water slid beneath a skin of white, carrying small pieces of ice that turned once, touched the edge, and disappeared under. The sound was not loud. It was not meant for anyone far away. It was the kind of sound a person hears only after standing still long enough for the ears to stop searching for engines, voices, doors, and judgment. Her hands were empty. That seemed important. She had found money and did not hold it. She had found a letter and did not read it. She had found tools and did not yet use them. All day, the world had offered her reasons to hurry. Cold, hunger, debt, a roof split open, county warnings, the memory of a birthday door closing behind her. But here, in front of black water moving through winter, haste seemed like another form of fear. Sadie stayed until her feet began to ache. When she returned to the shed, the stove still held coals. She fed them 2 thin cedar scraps and watched flame gather. On the bench, beneath oilcloth, the old tools waited with their handles darkened by hands no longer living. Inside the steam tube, the tin box rested where it had rested through seasons of snow. Rain, heat, silence, and official neglect. The unopened letter lay beneath a clean rag, its first line hidden again. She closed the door as tightly as she could and set the broken mallet against the bottom gap. Then she sat beside the stove, palms open to the heat, and listened. The shed was not empty. It had been waiting. Morning came through the roof seam in a narrow blade of pearl. Sadie had slept badly, not because the floor was colder than before, or because the wind pressed at the door until the mallet shifted twice in the night, but because the unopened pages had made a separate room inside the room. She rose before the stove had fully died, fed it with 2 finger-thick pieces of cedar, and waited until the flame had enough strength to catch without being watched every second. Then she put water on to boil and washed her hands as carefully as the cold allowed. Soot remained beneath the nails. Oil darkened the lines across her palms. There was nothing to be done about that except work and time. She did not open the letter immediately. First, she closed the door better than she had the night before, stuffing cotton rope into the lower gap and setting the heavy crate against it. Then she swept the bench with a clean rag, moved the tools to one side, and placed the tin box before her as one might set a basin before washing. The stove warmed the back of her skirt. The windows held a pale frost at their edges. Outside, the marsh lay still beneath cloud. Only then did she lift the packet tied with blue thread. The handwriting stopped her before the words did. It was not the same as the labels on the cedar templates. Not exactly. But it carried the same discipline, the same narrow loops and upright stems, each letter formed by someone who believed a mark should serve the reader long after the hand was gone. Sadie had seen a cousin of that hand in the shop weekends of her girlhood, on patterns, measurements, and the backs of envelopes used for calculations. This was older, more formal. Yet kinship passed through ink as surely as through a face. The paper had been folded along 4 creases. She opened it gently so they would not split. The first line waited at the top, plain as bread. My dear one, whoever you are. Sadie lowered herself onto the crate beside the bench and began to read. My dear one, whoever you are. If you have opened this box, then the shop has either survived us or been found after we failed it. I am writing from Duluth, Minnesota, in a room on the 3rd floor of St. Mary's Hospital, where Dr. Elias Merritt has told me the growth in my lungs is not the kind that loosens its hold. He said it with kindness, and kindness is something, but it does not plane a board or mend a roof. So I am using the strength left in my hands for what can still be done. My name is Elspeth Maravas Ranta, born in 1898 at Knife River, daughter of Anton Voss and Marja Letnan Voss. Anton was born near Turku, Finland, in 1869 and came through Duluth as a sawyer before he ever learned the English word for belonging. Marja came from the North Shore in 1874, Ojibwe and French on her mother's side, Finnish on her father's, and knew birch, cedar, and water better than any mapmaker I ever met. Anton's father, Juhani, built riverboats in the old country. Marge's grandmother, Ajawigi Jigukwe, stitched birch bark canoes near Grand Portage and taught that a vessel is not made for pride, but for passage. Their son, my brother Elias, carried the craft here to Birch Narrows. My son Peter learned it after him. His daughter Miriam learned enough before life pulled her elsewhere. If you are reading this, you may belong to one of us by blood, by mercy, or only by need. Need is not a lesser door. The trade closed here on October 17, 1951. That was the day the last completed canoe left the rack, ordered by a schoolteacher from Winton who paid in cash and potatoes because he had 6 children and poor timing. By then aluminum had begun to crowd the lakes. Roads had improved, and people wanted what could be bought quickly and dented without grief. Peter was gone, and Elias was old, and I had buried more tools than I had sold boats. We shut the front doors before the first snow and told ourselves it would only be for winter. Sometimes winter is 30 years long. There has been silence since. not empty silence. Kept silence. The kind inside a seed, or a cedar rib cooling in its form. My husband, Samuel Ranta, died of influenzas before our boy could remember his voice. My brother Elias returned from the Great War with mustard gas in his chest and never again climbed a hill without stopping. My son Peter was killed in France in 1944. Serving with the army in the war, they said, would finish the world's appetite for war. The medal in this box is his. Do not sell it. If you can bear it, place it someday where his name is cut in stone. If you cannot, keep it dry and let that be enough. Now listen carefully, because grief is not the only inheritance here. White cedar must be winter cut if you can manage it. Fell when the sap sleeps, split along the grain, and reject any piece that twists against the hand. For ribs, soak 2 days in clean water if the wood is older than 1 season. Steam at a full boil, 212 degrees, never less, and allow 1 hour per inch of thickness, with 10 minutes added when the shop is below freezing. Do not crowd the tube. Steam must pass every face. Bend within 30 seconds of removal. Use wool gloves over leather if you value your fingers. Bring the rib down to the form in one deliberate motion, then persuade the shoulders with even pressure. If the outside face begins to check, stop and shave the next piece thinner. Pride wastes wood. For canvas, stretch from center toward the stems, not from one end like a bedsheet. Fill with silica, boiled linseed oil, and spar varnish in a ratio of 4:2:1 by volume, adding enough Japan dryer to teach it patience but not hurry it into cracking. Keep the shop above 50 degrees for curing if God and the stove permit. If they do not, wait. Waiting is also work. The routes in the Black Ledger are older than permits and newer than prayer. Some were used by trappers, some by families avoiding bad weather, some by women who knew where blueberries grew after fire. Do not show them to careless men. Water remembers boots and paddles, but it does not remember greed kindly. As for the money, I saved it from orders, from mending, from wartime allotments, from years of doing without what neighbors called necessary. It is not treasure. It is time stored in paper. Use a little to make the building honest. Use none to become grand. Grand things rot from the center when no one is looking. Buy nails, glass, lime, food enough to stand upright, and tools only when the old ones will not serve. Leave the rest if you can. Someone after you may come colder than you did. Inheritance is not ownership, though the law prefers that word. It is a hand on your shoulder in the dark. It is being trusted by the dead to make one careful choice after another. If you have no family left, begin with the work. Work is a stern relative, but it does not abandon the patient. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elspeth Mara Voss, Birch, January 6, 1979. Sadie finished the last line and did not move. The stove clicked softly as iron expanded and settled. Water in the kettle breathed against its lid. Outside, a branch scraped once along the siding and then was still. The letter lay open between her hands, not glowing, not trembling, only present, which was more than enough. Some sentences seemed to remain on the page. Others had already gone into the room, into the tools, into the floor beneath her boots. She read it a second time. The second reading was slower. She paused over the names, not to claim them too quickly, but to let each stand upright for a moment. Anton, Marja, Juhani, Ajawigi Jigukwe, Elias, Peter, Miriam, Elspeth, The line did not come to her as a grand procession. It came like tracks crossing snow, some deep, some nearly drifted over, all heading toward the place where she sat with cracked hands and soot under her nails. She noticed practical things then. The temperature for steam, the timing, the ratio for filler, the warning about the routes, the instruction about the metal, the advice on what money could become if treated without care. These details steadied her more than tenderness would have done alone. Whoever had written the letter had not mistaken sorrow for permission to be vague. She had left numbers because numbers could be obeyed in a cold room by someone who did not yet know how to trust welcome. Sadie folded the paper along its original creases. She did not smooth it flat or create new lines. Old folds knew where they belonged. She pressed each crease gently with the side of her thumb, then placed the letter back on the bench atop the oilcloth, not in the tin box yet. Some things needed to remain in sight for one morning. The sentence about a marker had not been direct. It had appeared on the back of a smaller page inside the packet, written below a list of route names and beside a sketch no larger than her palm. 4 walnut trees. A back door. A horseshoe fixed in the second trunk from the marsh. Under it, the words, "If the tree takes the iron, let it hold the memory." Sadie put on her coat. The back door resisted, then opened with a sigh of ice at the threshold. Cold air entered, clean and hard. She stepped onto the narrow stoop and down into snow that had crusted overnight. The walnut trees stood with their branches lifted against the pale sky, each one carrying winter in the crooks of its limbs. She counted from the marsh side. 1, 2. The second tree was the widest. At first she saw only bark, ridged and dark, scarred by age and weather. Then, when she moved closer and brushed snow from the trunk with her sleeve, iron appeared. A horseshoe had been nailed there long ago, but the tree had grown around it, swallowing both ends and half the curve, leaving a dark crescent emerging from the wood like a memory the living trunk had chosen not to reject. Sadie touched it with one finger. The iron was cold enough to burn. Around it, the bark had folded and thickened, patient as healing skin. No plaque marked it. No carving announced its meaning. It had waited without needing to be understood. Beneath the tree, snow lay smooth except for her own footprints and the delicate tracks of a bird. She looked back at the shed. From outside, it seemed more vulnerable than it had from within. The torn roof, the sagging corner, the chimney with its poor cap, the sign whose letters survived only as differences in weathering. It would take work beyond anything she had done. It would take money carefully spent, credit honestly kept, and help she did not yet know how to receive. It might still fail. A county stamp did not stop rot. A letter did not lift rafters. But the horseshoe was in the tree. That fact did not solve anything. It did not need to. It held. Inside again, she searched the tin box for the object Elspeth had wrapped in the same cloth as the metal. It was small, no longer than her hand, rolled in brown paper that had darkened to the color of tea. When she opened it, she found a beeswax candle, thick and uneven. Its surface bloomed with a white powdery film from age. Tied around it was a strip of cotton marked, "Made for Christmas. 1919. Keep for a dark house." The wick looked dry but whole. Sadie stood with the candle in her palm, uncertain whether burning it would destroy something that had survived a century by not being used. Yet the tag had not said preserve. It had said keep for a dark house. She looked around the back room, at the steam tube, the tools, the tin box, the window frost, the breath of the stove trying to warm air that kept escaping. This qualified. She set the candle in a chipped saucer from the counter shelf. The first match broke. She held the second more carefully. Sulfur flared, sharp and blue at the edge, then settled into a yellow tongue. She touched it to the wick and waited. For a moment nothing happened. Then the wick darkened, bent, and took flame with a small steadiness that seemed out of proportion to its size. The candle smelled faintly of honey, smoke, and a summer field no one living could point to. The light changed the room. Not much. It did not overcome morning. It did not reach the corners. But it gave the tools a warmer edge and laid a trembling gold line along the cedar disc. It made the letter look less like an artifact and more like correspondence. Sadie sat before it, hands on her knees, watching old wax begin to soften under fire. She thought of the chain that had brought her there, though thought was not the right word for the way each face rose and then stepped back. Mrs. Kaleva in the library, offering an envelope that would do. The boy at the grocery counter waiting without impatience while coins were counted beneath fluorescent light. Mrs. Rukavina sliding the deed across the counter, then a paper bag with 2 rolls and a lie kind enough to leave unchallenged. Harlan Steger writing her name on an account card and calling debt by a name that did not shame her. The red-mitten woman in cloquet passing coffee through a cracked car window because plain was too cold. None of them had saved her. That was important. They had not gathered in a circle, named her suffering, and carried her to safety. They had done smaller things. An envelope. A pause. A roll. A line of credit. A hot cup. Each gesture had been narrow enough to fit through the door of ordinary life, and because of that, none of them had looked heroic while being done. Yet here she was, beside a stove in a room that had waded through snow and official abandonment, reading a letter from a woman who understood that time could be stored for someone colder. If you are listening to this in a lit room, with a cup beside you or a blanket across your knees, maybe you remember such a kindness. Not the grand kind people tell at banquets, but the small one that arrived without demanding to be admired. A neighbor who cleared your steps before you woke. A nurse who warmed the blanket first. A stranger who waited while you counted change. A teacher who wrote one honest sentence in a margin and left you stronger than praise would have done. Tell us, if you are able, about one small kindness you once received and never forgot. These stories travel farther when they carry real names, real weather, and the ordinary mercy of being seen at the right hour. Sadie did not speak any of those names aloud. The room held them anyway. By afternoon, she had made new lists, this time on the back of a blank order form from the tin box. The first list was not dreams. It was repairs. Door, roof seam, chimney cap, sill corner, pump, outhouse, glass. The second list was obligations. Hardware account, county inspection, metal, letter storage. The third was a rule she wrote only once and underlined: spend for work, not escape. Then she returned the money to the tin box. Not all of it went back into the compartment. That felt too much like hiding from herself. She removed enough for immediate repair and food, folding the bills into an envelope labeled with the date, then sealed the rest inside the box with the ledgers, maps, coins, metal, and letter. She placed the tin box beneath the bench for the night, behind a crate of cedar scraps, where it would be near but not visible from the front door. The tools she wrapped again, each according to its shape. The draw-knife lay in oilcloth, the crooked knife in waxed paper. The spoke shaves together, blades turned inward. She did not yet have proper storage, so she used the highest shelf, the one least likely to take damp from the floor. Before setting them there, she wiped each handle lightly with a rag warmed near the stove, removing only surface dust, not the dark polish of hands. Evening came early. It came blue through the front windows, then gray, then black, and the candle took over the work of showing edges. Sadie ate oatmeal again, this time with 1 spoonful of sugar bought on credit that morning from Harlan, after she had returned to town with careful cash in her pocket and a face he studied but did not question. The sugar made the meal almost too rich. She saved half for breakfast because sweetness, like money, could be wasted by being treated as proof that hunger had ended forever. Before sleep, she checked the door brace, the stove draft, the tin box, and the letter. The letter she did not return to the packet. Instead, she folded it into a square of clean cloth and placed it beside the pillow she had made from her spare sweater. The candle, burned down by a thumb's length, she extinguished with the dampened end of a cedar sliver, not by blowing. Smoke rose straight for a moment, then leaned toward the roof seam and vanished into the dark. She lay on the floor with the heirloom tools wrapped above her on the shelf, the tin box beneath the bench, the metal inside it, and the folded letter within reach of her hand. Outside, wind moved through the walnut branches and over the iron horseshoe held in living wood. Inside, the stove settled into coals. The building creaked once, then grew still around her. Not empty, not safe, not finished, but inhabited by more than cold. Sadie slept with her fingers resting on the cloth-wrapped pages. The first real snow after the letter came on December 6, and by noon the yard had taken 7 new inches. It did not fall like a storm in a story. It came without drama, straight down and steady, filling the broken places, because emptiness was always the first thing weather entered. Sadie woke to a pale drift stretched across the center of the front room, smoother than the one before, its surface rounded where flakes had sifted through the roof seam all night. The stove held ash and a thumb of coal. The windows had gone white at the lower corners. On the bench, beneath oilcloth, the wrapped tools kept their patient shapes. She did not climb that morning. Harlan's blue repair book lay open beside the stove, weighted flat with 2 brass screws. She had already read the roof chapter once the previous night, but tired reading and working reading were not the same. So she read it again after oatmeal, mouthing certain words without sound. Pitch, underlayment, exposure, flashing, sister rafter, ice dam. She copied the diagrams into her notebook, not because she trusted her drawing, but because the hand learned what the eye only borrowed. By afternoon she read the chapter a 3rd time. The book's advice was plain and northern. Do not trust snow to show you where the roof is weak. Do not stand between rafters unless the sheathing is proven. Do not patch rotten wood with hope. If you cannot afford a full repair, keep water moving downward and away. Temporary work is still work, but it must not lie about itself. Sadie stood in the front room and looked up. The failed roof was not one wound but several related injuries. The western slope had lost shingles along a seam where 2 sheets of old sheathing met. Water had entered there, followed a rafter, softened the nail line, and opened the black gap she had seen from outside. Near the chimney, flashing had lifted and rusted through at the uphill side. Along the eave, ice had backed beneath the lower courses, leaving shingles curled like old leaves. It was too much for one repair and not enough reason to surrender. She measured with string first. The building was 31 feet and 6 inches long along the front wall, 18 feet and 2 inches wide at the north end, and nearly 5 inches wider at the south where the sagging corner had pulled out of square. The roof pitch was steep enough that she measured from inside, counting rafters and using a cedar strip marked at 1-foot intervals. The worst exposed area came to roughly 10 feet by 12, but Harlan told her over the hardware counter to buy as if the weather were sneakier than arithmetic. "Water reads the whole roof," he said. "Not just your list." She came back with 36 square feet of black felt. Not enough for a proper job, but enough for the open seam. A bundle of mismatched asphalt shingles Harlan had saved from 3 repairs. 1 pound of 1¼ inch galvanized roofing nails, 6 feet of step flashing reclaimed from a torn-down porch, and a coffee can of larger nails for temporary boards. The shingles cost $8 because no customer wanted 3 colors mixed. The felt was $4.60. The flashing was written on her account for 3. Nails were exact. Harlan weighed them on a hanging scale and wrote $2.30 beside her name. When he finished, he reached beneath the counter and brought out a hatchet. It was small, with a roofing blade worn narrow by years of striking and trimming. The pole had mushroomed slightly. The handle was hickory, dark at the grip and split near the end, wrapped in black tape that had hardened. Sadie recognized use before beauty. "Belonged to my father's brother," Harlan said. "Roofed cabins from here to Isabella until his knees turned traitor. I cannot buy that. I did not price it." She looked at him. "Bring it back when the roof stops leaking," he said. "Or keep it working. Either will do." The man who helped her climb came 2 days later. His name was Nils Ockery, and he arrived without introduction in a blue wool cap, wool trousers patched at both knees, and boots older than some of the roads Sadie had walked. He had been a roofer before his hips stiffened and before ladders began to look, as he said, too ambitious. Harlan had not asked permission to send him. Mrs. Rukavina had not asked permission to tell him where the condemned shed stood. The town, which had seemed so reserved when Sadie first entered it, had begun to pass knowledge along in quiet, practical ways. Nils refused coffee because she had none fit to offer. He refused money before she spoke of it. "I will point," he said. "You will climb." He had the terse teaching style of a man who trusted work more than explanation. He did not praise the first good nail or condemn the first poor one. He used short words in his cane. He stood on the ground beside the walnut trees, tilted his head, and read the roof the way another person might read a letter. Rafters gone soft. Sadie looked up from the eave. "Which one?" "Third from chimney." She found it by pressing, gently, from inside first. The rafter had not failed completely, but rot had taken the upper edge where water had traveled. Nils showed her how to sister it with a sound 2x6 Harlan had sold cheap because one end was split. She cut away the split, measured the sister board to bridge well past the damage, and pre-drilled holes so the old wood would not shatter. The bolts were salvaged, cleaned with a wire brush, and tightened with a wrench that slipped twice before holding. "Flush," Nils called. Sadie adjusted. Not proud. She adjusted again. On the roof, she moved on hands and knees. She tied rope around her waist because Nils insisted, though neither of them pretended the rope would save much if the whole slope gave way. Its usefulness was simpler. It reminded her she had a body worth protecting. She shoveled snow from only the area she meant to work, leaving the rest as weight she did not yet understand. She pulled soft shingles with the roofing hatchet, sliding the blade under tabs, lifting nails carefully, saving anything not ruined. The chalk line felt ceremonial. Nils showed her how to snap it across the lower course, blue dust marking a straight promise on uneven roof. "Trust the line," he said, "but check the wall." She learned the three-stroke nail by repetition. First stroke to set, second to drive, third to seat. Not 4 anxious taps. Not one proud blow that bruised the shingle. 3. Deliberate and square. When a nail head stood above the surface, Nils saw it from the ground. That nail's proud. Sadie pulled it. Again. Again. Too hard. She learned to place felt so water would lap over, not under. She learned that flashing was a conversation between roof and chimney, and that the uphill side mattered most because water coming down had more intention than water already passed. She learned to trim shingles with the hatchet against a scrapboard, not against the roof itself. She learned that cold shingles cracked if handled like summer ones, so she warmed a few at a time inside near the stove and carried them out wrapped in burlap. The work took 11 days, not 11 full days on the roof. Weather broke them into fragments. 2 mornings were too windy. One afternoon brought sleet that froze on the rungs of the borrowed ladder and made Nils point toward the ground without a word. Another day, Sadie's wrists swelled from hammering, and she spent the dark hours rubbing them with warm cloths, ashamed of how personal pain became when there was no one to hand the tool to. Yet each day left evidence. Sistered rafter firm beneath the palm. Felt laid black and flat. A row of shingles seated. Flashing tucked. Roof cement used sparingly beneath an edge where no proper replacement could yet be made. Nails gathered in a jar instead of left for boots. Rotten sheathing cut back and patched with boards Harlan called ugly but honest. The open seam narrowed, then disappeared under overlapping courses that did not match in color but agreed in purpose. By mid-December, the roof no longer admitted snow. Sadie stood inside during the next fall and watched the ceiling with a bowl in her hand, prepared to catch betrayal. Nothing came through the main seam. Near the chimney, one small drip appeared, slow and dark, then stopped after she packed the flashing joint again from outside. The front room remained cold. The sagging corner still waited. But the drift that had divided the floor for days began to shrink, not from new snow, but from the stove in the absence of more. Nils came on the 11th afternoon, climbed 3 rungs despite his promise not to, pressed one mitten against the lower course, and descended. "We'll last winter," he said. Sadie understood that as high praise. She cleaned the roofing hatchet with an oily rag before hanging it on a nail near the door, where she could see it from the floor at night. It was not hers exactly. It was trusted to her, which was sometimes a stronger condition. Outside, the walnut branches carried fresh snow. Inside, for the first time, the building seemed to hold its breath without losing it. January began with the chimney shedding itself onto the hearth. At first it was only red dust on the floor beneath the thimble, a powder fine as paprika. Then a brick face the size of Sadie's palm popped from the lower stack during a cold night and struck the stovepipe with a clean metallic ping. She was awake at once, sitting upright in the dark, listening for the second sound that might mean collapse. None came, but by morning she saw the truth in daylight. The bricks had been spalling for years. Frost had entered cracks in the mortar, frozen, expanded, thawed, and entered again. The outer faces of several bricks had flaked away, leaving softer interiors exposed. Between courses, the mortar had turned to powder where a fingernail could scrape it loose. The chimney still drew, but draw was not safety. Heat and weakness had been negotiating above her while she slept. Harlan came to look on the 4th day of the month. He stood with one hand on the stovepipe, not touching it until it cooled, and tilted his head at the chimney wall. "You have lime mortar," he said. "Do not put hard Portland in that soft old brick unless you want the brick to lose the argument." Sadie wrote that down. He set 3 paper sacks on the floor. One held hydrated lime. One held fine sand. The smallest held fire clay, its surface printed with a brand from a company that no longer existed. For inside joints near heat, 3 parts sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, 1 part fire clay. Damp, not soupy. Let the old brick drink first. If you pack dry mortar into thirsty brick, it will rob the mix and leave you dust again. The fire clay had come from the back of his storage room, Harlan said, and the price was whatever his ledger decided later. Sadie did not argue. Some gifts wore the coat of future accounting so the receiver could keep standing. The work lasted 3 weeks in temperatures that mostly stayed in the 20s by day and fell lower after dark. She began by raking out failed joints with a narrow chisel and a bent screwdriver filed into a tool. The old mortar came free in powder, then crumbs, then stubborn ledges where moisture had not reached. She worked only small sections at a time. Harlan had warned her that a chimney, like a spine, did not appreciate having too much loosened at once. She vacuumed nothing because she had no vacuum. Instead, she brushed with a stiff whisk broom, caught debris in a pan, and wiped each joint with a damp rag until the brick showed its actual edges. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes. Gloves were too clumsy for the smallest joints, and the mortar told its truth by feel. She could sense when the mix was too sandy, when it dragged rather than packed, when a joint still held loose grit behind what looked clean. So she worked bare-handed for as long as the fingers obeyed, then stopped, held them near the stove, and waited for pain to return. Pain became the timer. When it came back sharp and needling, she flexed each finger, wiped them dry, and returned. The first batch failed. She mixed it too wet, worried it would not press deep enough. It sagged from the joint and streaked the brick face. She scraped it out before it set, washed the area, and sat on the floor with her knees drawn up, reading the paragraph again. Damp, not soupy. The second batch held better. She pressed it in layers with a pointing trowel Harlan lent her, then struck the joint slightly recessed so the old brick edges remained proud enough to shed water. At night, she banked the stove low because fresh mortar disliked extremes. This made sleeping colder. She wore her coat over 2 sweaters and tucked the letter packet beneath her folded clothes, not from fear now, but from habit. The candle had been saved after that first burning and used only when the work required a steady light near the chimney. Its flame showed imperfections daylight missed, a gap behind a joint, a hairline crack traveling upward, the sheen of mortar too wet to be trusted. By the second week, Sadie had learned the chimney's history through damage. One lower section had been rebuilt in a different brick, likely after a stove change. The upper corner near the roof had been patched badly with hard gray mortar that trapped water and forced the brick around it to fail sooner. The thimble had been reset at least once. Finger marks remained in an old joint near the hearth, 3 shallow grooves left by someone who had smoothed wet lime with a bare hand decades before. Sadie did not smooth hers that way. She used the trowel, but she placed her fingers beside the marks once, measuring the span of the unknown hand against her own. Late January brought a clear day with sun so bright on the snow that the windows shone. The mortar had cured enough for a test fire. Sadie prepared as if for a ceremony, though the work itself was practical. She cleared the stove box, checked the pipe joints, opened the draft, warmed the flue with a twist of burning paper. Outside, she had placed the old mirror against a stump where she could see the chimney top through the window's reflection without running out every minute. The first smoke climbed thin and gray. She added cedar splinters, then a piece of dry birch Harlan had sent with Caleb from the cafe side door, though she had not yet learned the boy's name. The stove took. The pipe warmed. Sadie watched the chimney wall for any breath of smoke through joints. None appeared. She stepped outside and looked up. Smoke rose clean from the chimney, narrow and nearly blue against the cold sky. It did not roll down the roof. It did not seep through the brick. It lifted, broke apart, and entered the day without shame. Sadie stood in the snow with bare hands tucked under her arms, the smell of lime still in her sleeves, and let herself watch until the smoke thinned from sight. The floors waited until the chimney could be trusted. They had been waiting from the first morning, speaking underfoot, warning, holding, dipping, and enduring whatever snow and neglect had lowered onto them. Once the roof no longer fed the central drift and the stove could burn without fear, Sadie turned her list downward. A building was not only what kept weather off. It was what carried a person through the rooms. The planks were white pine, wide as a man's open hand and laid in lengths no mill sold casually anymore. Some had been cut with a circular saw, their arcs faint beneath age. Others were older still, planed unevenly, fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails whose square shanks had gripped the joists through more winters than the county file remembered. The nails fascinated her. Their heads were not perfect circles. They rose in faceted little blooms, hammered one by someone who expected a foot to pass over them for generations. She did not want to replace what could be saved. The worst boards near the roof seam had cupped and softened from meltwater. 2 were beyond use. One near the front door broke under the pry bar, revealing a joist darkened but not gone. Harlan sold her 2 salvaged pine planks from an attic repair, close in width, though not in age. Nils came one afternoon, stood with his cane, and told her to number every board before lifting, even the ruined ones, because floors had a memory of sequence. "Do not scramble it," he said. She did not. The hand-cut nails came up slowly. Sadie worked a cat's paw beneath each head, rocking gently, easing the shank from the pine without splitting more than had already been split. Some nails could be saved and straightened against the bench. Others broke. The roseheads went into a shallow tin, not as treasure, but as evidence. New fasteners would hold what old ones could not, yet old work deserved not to be swept into ash. The sander came from a rental shelf behind Harlan's store. It was a random orbit sander, heavy and yellow, with a cord stiff from cold and a dust bag that had seen better customers. $14 a day. Deposit waived because Harlan looked at her, looked at the floor plan she had drawn, and wrote account beside the line without speaking. He sold her discs in 3 grits, 80, 120, and 220. "Do not start too fine," he said. "You will polish dirt into history and call it preservation." She began with 80. The machine shook through her shoulders and into her teeth. It made a sound like a hive trapped in a bucket. She worked with the grain, slow passes, overlapping each line, never staying in one place long enough to dish the pine. Dust rose despite the bag, golden and gray, carrying the smell of dry wood, old water stains, mouse ears, stove smoke, and something faintly resinous released after being sealed beneath grime. She wore the mask and still tasted the room. The first pass did not make the floor beautiful. It made it legible. Under the dark surface appeared grain lines, nail paths, old scars, and the ghost of where workbenches had once stood. There were crescent marks near the back room from dragged canoe forms. A burn near the stove where an ember had fallen and been stamped out. 2 parallel grooves leading toward the front doors, perhaps from sled runners or a boat cradle moved over and over. Sadie sanded around each mark when she could, softening splinters without erasing evidence. The 120 grit came next. By then her hands buzzed even after the sander stopped. At night, when she lay beside the stove, her fingers continued vibrating in the dark. She wrapped them in cloth and held them beneath her chin until they quieted. The finer pass revealed color, not new pine, not pale lumber, but a dark honey tone that had been waiting beneath dirt and oxidation. In the back room, where cedar dust had settled for years, the pine warmed toward amber. Near the stove, repeated heat had deepened it further. The 220 pass was not necessary everywhere, but she used it where bare feet might someday pass. That thought came without permission, and she did not chase it away. Bare feet meant summer. It meant enough safety to remove boots. It meant a room no longer treated only as survival. She sanded the boards near the stove, the path to the workbench, and the space beside the front counter until the surface no longer raised slivers under her palm. For finish, Harlan gave her two choices and reasons for both. Tung oil would cure harder and resist water better. Boiled linseed oil would warm the color and enter thirsty wood deeply, but it needed care and rags could burn if left folded. Sadie chose a mix under his guidance, 2 parts tung oil, 1 part boiled linseed oil, thinned slightly with citrus solvent he sold by the cup from a larger can because she did not need a full tin. 3 coats, 48 hours between, no shortcuts. Wipe on. Let it drink. Wipe off what remains. Do not leave shine sitting on top like vanity. The first coat vanished into the pine. She knelt with a rag wrapped around her hand and worked in sections, following the grain, watching the floor darken under the oil as if rain were moving across a dry field. Dark honey became brown sugar. Brown sugar became, in certain boards, a red depth close to mahogany. The replacement planks stayed lighter, honest about arriving late. She did not stain them to pretend otherwise. The used rag she laid flat outside on a rusted screen over snow, weighted with stones, just as Harlan had warned. No folded rags. No heat. No carelessness dressed as thrift. The second coat took less. The third sat longer before being wiped away. During the curing days, she walked only on narrow paths of craft paper. The shed smelled of oil, citrus, stove ash, and pine opening itself. She ate near the back door to keep crumbs from the finish. She slept on boards not yet treated. Shifting her bed twice as work moved through the rooms. Waiting became part of the labor. The floor could not be hurried merely because she was tired of stepping around it. Then came the bad morning. It was January 29th, though she only knew because she had written the date above the work list and then done nothing beneath it. She woke before dawn with every joint heavy, her hands swollen, throat raw from dust despite the mask, and a weariness so complete that even feeding the stove felt like lifting wet timber. The floor was ready for its final buffing. The chimney wanted inspection. The pump handle had frozen again. The account card at Harlan's store had grown longer than felt decent. None of it shouted. It simply waited. Sadie put on her coat and walked to the marsh. She carried no tool. That was the decision. At the edge of the water, where current had kept a black opening through the ice, a great blue heron stood on one leg in the shallows, improbable and still. Perhaps it had lingered too long into winter. Perhaps it had found what it needed where warmer springs fed the channel. Its long neck folded into itself, and its gray body matched the morning so closely that she almost missed it. She sat on a fallen log and watched. The cold entered through her skirt. Snow dampened the backs of her gloves. The heron did not perform wisdom. It did not heal her. It stood, exact and severe, conserving what warmth it had, striking once at water with a motion too quick for thought, then returning to stillness as if stillness were not the absence of work but another form of it. Sadie did not work that day. She returned at dusk, ate oatmeal without sugar, and slept before the fire had fully settled. Nothing collapsed because she had stopped. No debt collector came. No ancestor withdrew welcome. By morning, the floor was still there, the tools still wrapped, the list still waiting in pencil. The shed was not empty. It had been waiting. On the last day of January, she buffed the final coat by hand with cloth until the pine held light rather than reflected it. When she crossed from the front room to the back, the floor answered differently. Not silent. No good floor was silent. But steady. A low, wooden assurance beneath each step. February entered through the windows because the windows had never learned how to keep it out. There were 8 in all. 3 had no glass, only cardboard, scraps of tar paper, and 1 piece of feed sack nailed across the opening by a hand long gone. 4 were cracked, each in its own pattern, a clean diagonal, a spiderweb near the lower sash, a missing corner, and 1 pane split so finely the line showed only when frost silvered it. The last window, in the back room above the workbench, was original to the building's first life, or near enough that no one living could prove otherwise. The date 1888 had been scratched into the upper rail, not by a child's idle nail but by a steady point before the wood fully hardened under finish. Sadie first misread it as 1788 in the weak light, and the number startled her into laughing once under her breath, the sound small and rough from disuse. No building in that yard had held the 18th century in its bones, but the old sash was still too rare to replace. Wavy glass remained in both panes, with tiny bubbles suspended in it like trapped breath. When she moved her head, the marsh beyond bent and righted itself through the imperfections. She wrote beside it, "Do not replace." Harlan approved. A person who throws away wavy glass should not be trusted with soup. The glass rack in his store held panes salvaged from storm windows, porch doors, and cabins improved by people with more money than reverence. He cut what she needed on a felt-covered table in the back, scoring each line once with a glass cutter that made a crisp, icy sound. Sadie watched the first break clean beneath his hands and wrote the measurements again to make sure the numbers had not changed between shed and store. For glazing, he sold her a small tub of DAP 33, its lid dented but sealed. "Warm it in your hands," he said. Cold putty lies. He added glazier's points, a putty knife with a flexible blade, 2 coils of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, and a small packet of brass brads. The sash cord mattered more than Sadie at first understood. 4 windows had weights hidden inside the jambs, their old cords broken and lying in stiff curls. Without new cord, the sashes would not hold open when summer came. February made summer seem theoretical, but repairs needed to believe in later weather. She began with the missing panes. The first sash came out stubbornly. Layers of paint held it in the channel, and she worked the seam with a thin knife, lifting chips no larger than fish scales. She labeled each stop, each screw, each piece of trim on a scrap of paper and laid them in order on the counter. Haste would have made a puzzle of the window. She had no strength to waste on puzzles she had created herself. The old putty was harder than bone. She warmed it with a cloth heated near the stove, then scraped in narrow passes, careful not to gouge the rabbet where new glass would sit. Broken points came out with pliers. Dust gathered. So did patience. When the channel was clean, she brushed it with a little oil primer Harlan had poured into a baby food jar, explaining that bare wood would drink oil from the putty and leave it cracked before its time. The new pane settled with a slight click. Sadie pressed glazier's points into the wood with the flat of the putty knife, 2 on each side, enough to hold without crowding. Then she worked the putty. At first it stuck to her fingers, cold and stubborn. She rolled it between her palms until it softened, pressed it into a rope, laid it along the edge, and drew the knife in a long bevel from glass to wood. The first line wavered. She scraped it off and tried again. By the fourth pane, her hand understood the angle. Not perfect. Honest. The cracked panes required decisions. She replaced the spider-webbed one because wind entered through the center and frost grew thick along the break. She left the clean diagonal temporarily, sealing it with a thin line of clear shellac and a narrow strip of tape until spring could offer better working conditions. Harlan had said every repair did not need to be completed in its final form the first time. Temporary was not sin if labeled temporary and remembered. The sash cords took longer than glass. Sadie removed the access panels from the side jambs and found the iron counterweights hanging uselessly in the pockets, their cords broken near the pulleys. Dust lay thick around them. One mouse nest occupied the north window pocket, dry and abandoned. She cleaned each cavity with a bent wire and rag, then threaded new 1/4-inch cotton cord over the pulley, with a sinker tied to twine, dropping it down into the pocket until she could fish it through the access opening. The knot mattered. Harlan had shown her on the counter, using a pencil for the weight. A figure-8 knot, tight enough not to pull through the eye, dressed cleanly so it would not catch inside the pocket. Sadie practiced 5 times before tying the first real one. The cord slid over the pulley, weight rising and falling with a soft iron whisper. When she reattached the other end to the sash, the window lifted and stayed. She stood there smiling with her mouth closed, one hand under the rail, as if greeting a creature returned to obedience after long sickness. 8 windows took most of February. Not because each task was large, but because every window had its own argument. Paint swelled. Screws stripped. One pane arrived 1/8 inch too wide because Sadie had measured from a warped corner instead of the true rabbit. She walked back to town with it wrapped in a towel, and Harlan recut it without remark, though he tapped the measurement twice and let her see the lesson. The original back window received only cleaning, cord, and a new stop shape from salvaged pine. Its wavy glass remained, distorting the marsh in the old pleasing way. As the openings tightened, the shed sounds changed. Wind no longer crossed a front room with a single long whistle. It found smaller notes, higher and less confident. The stove held warmth longer after dusk. Frost still rimed the panes on bitter mornings, but it formed delicate ferns instead of thick white blindness. Light entered more cleanly. Dust showed itself. So did progress. The last window was the western one nearest the walnut trees. It had lost its lower pane entirely and held cardboard that had gone soft at the edges. Sadie removed the cardboard on a late February afternoon when the sky had cleared after snow, and cold light poured into the room with almost spring-like force, though spring was still a promise under ice. She cleaned the rabbit, primed the wood, set the glass, pressed the points, and drew the DAP 33 in one slow bevel along the bottom edge. Outside, on a walnut branch level with the sash, a chickadee landed. It was small enough to seem made of the weather's leftover scraps. Black cap, white cheek, gray back, body round against the cold. It hopped once, then twice, and tilted its head toward Sadie through the new glass, as if inspecting the work. She held still, putty knife in hand. The bird's feet gripped the branch with exact confidence. Snow dusted the bark around it. Behind both of them, the marsh lay white and blue under the afternoon. The chickadee tapped the branch with its beak, shook loose 3 grains of snow, and flew. Sadie finished the bevel without lifting the knife. The plaster began to speak after the windows stopped shouting. Before then, every draft and leak had been louder. A broken window made itself known with frost. A roof seam wrote its complaint in snow. A chimney shed red dust and gave a warning sharp enough to wake a sleeping person in the dark. Plaster failed more privately. It loosened behind its own face. It held until touched. It waited for warmth, then showed its cracks in the lengthening light of late February. There were 3 bad patches, all near the chimney. The first had bulged above the stovepipe, a shallow swelling the size of a serving tray. When Sadie pressed it with 2 fingers, it moved away from the wall and returned with a tired click. The second had already fallen in crescent-shaped pieces onto the floor, exposing hand-split oak lath beneath. The third looked sound until the afternoon sun crossed it and showed a map of hairline cracks, each one leading toward the place where heat, damp, and years had worked together against the wall. She did not tear out more than failure required. Harlan had warned her about that too. Some people meet a loose patch and decide the whole room has insulted them. Then they gut a wall they should have listened to. The original plaster was horsehair, pale gray under its lime wash, laid over last split by hand and nailed with narrow, blackened nails. Between the strips, keys of old plaster still held in curled tongues, hard as bone where dry, soft as chalk where water had entered. Sadie removed loose material with a margin trowel, working from the center outward until resistance returned. The sound changed when she reached what still belonged. Failure was dull. Holding plaster gave a thin, settled ring. The oak lath beneath was worth saving. It had been split along the grain, not sawn, which meant its fibers rose and caught the first coat the way they were meant to. Some strips had darkened near the chimney, but most remained strong. Sadie brushed them clean with a stiff whisk broom, then misted them lightly with water. Dry lath, Harlan said, would steal moisture from fresh lime and leave it weak before it had a chance to become stone. The horsehair came from a paper bag older than she was. Harlan brought it in himself, wrapped in a grocery sack printed with a store logo from the 1950s. My father kept everything, he said, setting it on the bench. Mostly this was a burden. Today it is inventory. The hair had been cleaned and bundled, coarse and dark, with a faint barn smell that rose when Sadie opened the paper. She mixed lime, sand, and hair in a galvanized pan, cutting the fibers into the mortar with the edge of the trowel until they disappeared into the gray mass and reappeared only when pulled. First coat was the scratch coat, thick enough to push through the lath and form keys behind it. She pressed hard, working upward, then scored horizontal lines across the surface with a scrap of lath before it tightened. It looked rough. It was meant to. 3 days later came the brown coat, 3/8 of an inch, flattened but not polished. Built out to meet the old wall without pretending the room had never been injured. 72 hours of curing followed. She kept the stove low, misted the patch when the surface dried too fast, and checked for shrinkage cracks with a candle held near the wall. The candlelight showed every ridge and hollow honestly. She filled what needed filling. She left what belonged to handwork. The finished coat was thin, 1/8 of an inch, lime-rich and smooth enough to take whitewash later. By then her wrist knew the motion. Load the hawk. Lift with the trowel. Lay on. Draw upward. Feather the edge into the old plaster. Do not fuss after the surface begins to set. Overworked lime becomes vanity and weakness. She washed her tools between batches, kept the pan covered, and waited when waiting was required. Late in the day, after the last patch had begun to firm, Sadie stood back and looked at the wall. The repaired places were visible if a person looked. slightly different in texture, slightly truer in line. They did not claim to be original. They claimed only to belong from now on. That seemed right. She touched the air near the wall, not the plaster itself. These patches will hold another 100 years. She did not say it aloud. The sentence settled in her like an instruction, modest and exact. Doris at the cafe began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before she ever invited Sadie inside. At first, Sadie thought the bags had been misdelivered. The first one appeared on a Tuesday morning beside the smaller door, tucked beneath the overhang where snow could not reach it unless wind worked sideways. Inside were 2-day-old biscuits, a jar of soup gone thick with barley, and 3 tea bags folded into wax paper. No note. No explanation. Only the cafe's blue stamp on the side and the smell of onions, pepper, and warmth. Sadie carried the bag in and stood beside the stove with it in both hands. The next time she went to town, she stopped at the cafe after buying sash cord. The room was narrow, with 6 tables, a lunch counter, a pie case, and windows clouded at the lower edges from heat meeting cold. Above the register hung photographs of fish, school teams, and men in wool jackets standing beside deer. Behind the counter, Doris Sannel moved with a limp that did not slow her so much as give rhythm to every step. She had auburn hair faded toward gray, rolled sleeves, and flour on one forearm. Sadie waited until there were no customers at the register. "I think you left food at my door." Doris looked at her over half-glasses. "Did it spoil?" "No." "Mom." "Then I did not fail. I need to pay you." "I cannot take food without paying." Doris wiped the counter with a cloth that had already done more work than most people's good towels. "Then pay in candles when the shop reopens." Sadie had no answer ready for that. Doris pointed toward the pie case with the cloth. "Your people used to make candle lanterns for winter trips. My father had one. Bent cedar frame, mica sides. I remember the light. You make one someday. I will call us square. That may take a while. Most useful things do." The bags continued, though not every day and never so often that Sadie could call it feeding. A heel of rye bread, a jar of stew, coffee grounds wrapped tight. Once, a piece of apple cake with no frosting, still soft in the middle. Doris never mentioned them when Sadie came in. Sadie began returning the jars washed, with their lids tied on by string. Later, when she had repaired the front counter enough to hold weight, she placed the empty jars in a row and imagined candle lanterns beside them. Not for sale yet, only promised. Caleb arrived with a splitting maul and a Schwinn bicycle. The bicycle was red once, though winter and use had dulled it to the color of dried brick. Its rear fender rattled with every turn of the wheel, and the chain clicked in one place as it passed the sprocket. Caleb was 16, maybe 17, with dark hair too long under his cap, wrists too thin for his work gloves, and a way of looking at the ground before speaking that reminded Sadie of boys who had been told not to take up space indoors. He came on a Saturday when snow had softened enough to make walking miserable. Sadie was behind the shed, trying to split damp birch with a hatchet that did not have the weight for it. The pieces bounced from the chopping block with the ugly stubbornness of wood not yet ready to become fuel. Caleb leaned the bike against the walnut tree and lifted the maul from across his handlebars. "My mother said," he said. Sadie waited. "About your grandfather." The word struck strangely. Not because it was accurate or inaccurate, but because it came from outside her own mouth. Someone in town had reached backward through Arden, through the name on the deed, through whatever stories had survived, in kitchens and hardware aisles, and placed her inside a family shape larger than the one she had been handed at 18. Caleb sat around on the block and split it in one clean strike. He worked without show. Lift. Drop. Split. Stack. When Sadie tried to take the maul, he handed it over and watched her stance, not her face. Feet wider, he said. Let it fall. He did not accept money. I have some, Sadie said. He shook his head. I can pay a little. My mother. That does not explain much. He looked toward the marsh, where sunlight had begun to silver the ice. She said not everything needs explaining before you do it. They worked 2 hours. Caleb split the larger rounds, and Sadie stacked the smaller pieces under the eave on rails made from scrap cedar so air could pass beneath them. Before leaving, he tightened the loose fender on his Schwinn with a screwdriver from his pocket, then used the same screwdriver to fix the hasp on her front door because he had noticed it sat crooked. Come back for soup, Sadie said, surprising herself. He shrugged. Maybe. It meant yes, but not yet. Reverend Boyd did not enter the shed at all. He walked Fernburg Road every morning, snow or no snow, wearing a black coat greened by age at the cuffs and a felt hat brushed nearly bald at the crown. His church stood in town, a modest white building with a steeple that leaned just enough to make visitors nervous and locals fond. Sadie had seen him first from the roof, a dark figure moving along the road with measured steps, gloved hands clasped behind him. The first time he passed the logging cut while she was dragging kindling, he stopped at the entrance and tipped his hat. Morning. He looked past her toward the shed. Not assessing. Not pitying. Only seeing. You are making a start. I am trying. Then he walked on. After that, he passed nearly every morning. Sometimes he lifted a hand. Sometimes the cold was too sharp and he only nodded. He never asked whether she attended church. He never asked why she had come alone, or where her people were, or whether she understood how hard winter could be on a body without proper walls. Once, after a freezing rain, he left a pair of boot cleats hanging from a branch by the road with a note that read, "Found these. May be useful." The handwriting was tidy and slanted. In March, when the road shoulder thawed into ruts, Sadie was outside clearing ice from the pump when Reverend Boyd paused again. He tipped his hat toward the building. Lord, keep this house. 4 words. He did not wait to see whether she approved of prayer. He did not make the blessing an obligation. He placed it in the air and continued walking, his steps steady over the dirty snow. Sadie watched him until the trees hid him. Then she returned to the pump, and the handle, after weeks of argument, came down smoothly on the first pull. The seller had waited because Sadie had let it. There were enough dangers above ground to justify postponement. A roof could kill by falling. A chimney could poison by drawing badly. A floor could drop a person into rot. Windows could freeze sleep into a body. A cellar, unseen beneath all that, became easy to list under later. But later gathered weight. By February 11th, with the plaster curing and the windows mostly tight, the closed trapdoor near the backroom bench could no longer be passed without answer. It lay beneath a plank cover fitted into the floor and ringed with iron. The ring had rusted flat against the wood. Sadie worked it free with oil, heat, and the tip of the awl, then lifted with both hands. The door rose reluctantly. Cold air came up, different from the cold above. Below-ground cold, stone cold. Damp without wind. It carried the smell of mineral earth, old potatoes, and the faint, sweet rot of leaves carried in by some animal years earlier. She set the door back and waited. No movement sounded below. No animal scrambled. No sudden collapse followed the opening. She lowered a lantern borrowed from Harlan by a rope and watched its flame. It leaned, then steadied. Air moved, but not badly. There were 7 granite steps down, each worn in the middle by feet that had used them before fear made the door easier to ignore. Sadie descended sideways, one hand on the wall, boots testing each tread. The cellar was 12 feet by 15, fieldstone at the walls, packed earth between stones in some joints, and a floor made of larger flat stones laid with more care than a root cellar strictly required. Frost glittered in 2 corners. A narrow vent to the outside had been screened with old mesh and half-blocked by snow. At the center of the floor was a single-dressed granite slab. It did not match the fieldstones around it. It had been cut square, 3 feet by 3 feet perhaps, with beveled edges and a carved mark at its center, the same long canoe shape crossed by 3 short lines. The craft mark. The family mark. The one on the cedar disc, on a few templates, on the upper corner of a notebook. Sadie stood at the foot of the stairs and looked at it for a long time. She did not lift it. There are objects a person meets before she is ready to ask what they cover. The slab was one. It sat flush with the surrounding stones, heavy enough to require more than one body or a set of tools she did not have. But weight was not the reason she left it. The reason was quieter. The house had not offered everything at once. It had given the steam tube when she had learned to listen. It had given the letter when she had closed the door and made fire. Whatever lay beneath the granite, if anything did, belonged to a later kind of courage. She swept around it instead. A cellar deserved order even when mysteries remained. She found broken jars, 2 cracked crocks, a barrel hoop, a rusted mousetrap, and a shelf collapsed under its own damp boards. She carried debris up in buckets and stacked salvage near the back door. The usable stones she left. The rotten wood she set aside for burning only after drying and only if no paint or rot made it unwise. The work warmed her despite the cold. On the stairs going up, her boot struck something under the 3rd step. The sound was wood against stone, not stone against stone. She knelt on the 4th step and held the lantern close. Beneath the 3rd tread, wedged back where shadow had hidden it, was a small oak box no larger than a loaf of bread. It had been pushed into a recess between the riser and the side wall, then held in place by a wooden shim. Dust covered its lid, but the box itself was dry. Sadie worked it loose slowly. It came free with a sigh of grit. The lid had no lock, only a brass hook that lifted with a small click. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype photograph wrapped in cloth. The key was dark with tarnish, except where the bow had rubbed against the cloth. Its bow was shaped like the craft mark, a narrow canoe outline crossed by 3 ribs. The shaft was short, the bit complex, cut for a lock older and more deliberate than any door hardware currently in the shed. It had weight beyond size. Sadie held it in her palm and felt, not for the first time, that the dead had been exact in ways the living might mistake for secrecy. The photograph had silvered at the edges. In it, a young woman stood in front of the very cottage that formed the front part of the shop before additions had lengthened it into a working shed. The walnut trees were thin behind her, newly planted or not yet strong. She wore a long skirt and a plain blouse with sleeves rolled to the forearm. In one hand she held a crooked knife. Her face was young, grave, and familiar enough that Sadie's breath stopped before thought could organize the recognition. Not identical. No photograph offered that. But the set of the mouth, the watchful eyes, The strong line between brow and nose, the way she held the tool as if it were not a prop but an extension of responsibility. It was a face Sadie had met in mirrors without ever knowing it had stood on that ground before her. On the back, written in ink-faded brown, were the words, Elspeth Voss, daughter of Anton, age 25, summer of 1903. Sadie read the date twice, though arithmetic protested softly at the edges of the family story already given. Time in neglected families did not always arrive in straight lines. Names repeated. Daughters were raised by aunts. Children belonged where they were kept, not always where records placed them. The photograph did not solve anything. It deepened everything. She carried the box upstairs and placed it on the workbench. The brass key she set on the mantel above the stove, where its shape caught firelight in the evenings. She did not know what it opened. She did not try every lock in the building merely to satisfy unease. Some answers grew worse when rushed. The tintype she wrapped again and placed beside the letter packet, because faces and words belonged near each other until a better place could be made. That night, the cellar door remained open for an hour while warmer air moved down and damp air rose. Sadie sat near the stove and looked from the brass key to the floor, then toward the place beneath which the granite slab waited. She let the unknown remain unknown. It had waited this long. It could wait longer without being harmed by her patience. Spring did not arrive at Birch Narrows as a color. It arrived first as sound. In March, the creek beneath the ice grew louder after noon, a hidden urgency under white crust and black water. Snow withdrew from the south side of the shed in a ragged line, revealing flattened grass, rusted nails, and cedar scraps that had vanished months before under drift. The pump thawed sooner each morning. Icicles loosened from the eaves and fell with clean, startling cracks. The road became mud beneath slush, then mud alone, and every trip to town left Sadie's hem freckled brown. By late March, the walnut trees wore catkins. They appeared modestly, as if embarrassed by softness after so much hard weather. The buds swelled. Chickadees came more often. Once, a red squirrel crossed the roof and scolded the chimney cap with the confidence of a creature who had never paid taxes or repaired flashing. Sadie watched it from the workbench and let the small intrusion stand. Inside, the shed smelled different. Less of damp. More of oil, lime, pine, ash, and the faint sweetness of cedar that warmed whenever sun reached the back room. The plaster patches had cured pale. The windows held. The floor took morning light in long amber bands. The front counter, scrubbed and tightened, no longer looked abandoned, only empty. Empty was not the same as ruined. Empty could be prepared. The craft waited too. The notebooks remained wrapped except when studied with clean hands. Sadie read them slowly, copying instructions onto fresh pages, marking words she did not yet understand, tracing patterns on brown paper taped to the bench. She did not begin a canoe that spring. Not a true one. The decision cost her less than she expected. A whole vessel required dry stock, proper forms, canvas, filler, space, weather, and a skill that did not come from longing simply because longing was sincere. Instead, she ordered practice materials. 1 coin paid for the first small bundle. Not the silver dollar, not the oldest pieces, only a worn quarter whose value in money was less than its value as permission. With it and a few modern bills, she bought thin cedar strips, scrap ash, a small bottle of hide glue, and a new card scraper because none of the old blades had quite the right edge for practice. Harlan wrapped the scraper in brown paper and wrote the cost on the account card without comment. Sadie practiced bending samples in a kettle rig no larger than a bread box. She ruined the first strip. The second checked at the outside curve. The third bent unevenly because she hesitated after removing it from steam. The fourth held. She labeled each failure with date, time, wood, temperature, and mistake, then hung them on a cord above the bench where they could teach without shame. Work was a stern relative, but it had begun to recognize her. April opened the marsh. Water appeared first at the edges, then in channels, then in wide dark panes between thinning ice. Geese came over in ragged lines, calling down to whatever part of the earth had promised them return. Mud softened around the pump. The outhouse door no longer froze shut. Doris sent fewer paper bags because the roads were easier and because Sadie had begun to walk into town with a list that included food before supplies when food was required. By the end of April, the shed no longer seemed to be surviving winter. It seemed to be entering weather. Sadie washed the front window, inside and out. She swept the threshold. She took the old sign down only long enough to clean the board and tighten its fasteners, then rehung it above the doors, leaving the weathered letters as they were. New paint would come later, if at all. Some names did not need to be bright to be legible. The craft would wait until her hands knew more. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, the first finished canoe rested on padded horses in the back room while snow gathered without entering. It was not large. 12 feet, narrow in the beam, built for one careful paddler and perhaps a small pack, not for admiration on a showroom floor. Its ribs were white cedar bent in the shop's own steam, each one coaxed into form after test strips had taught Sadie which grain would comply and which would betray. The planking lay fair, not flawless. The canvas had been stretched from center toward the stems on a cold, bright morning with the stove burning steadily, and Caleb, taller now and less careful about taking up space, holding one end while Sadie tacked the other. The filler had cured through a long season of waiting. She had followed the old ratio, adjusting only where modern materials required mercy. Sanding had taken evenings. Varnish had taken longer because dust loved wet shine and because the shed still belonged partly to weather, mice, and the road. The final coat had dried to a low glow, not glossy enough to brag. When Sadie ran her palm along the hull, she felt small imperfections no customer might notice and every builder would know. They did not shame her. They signed the work. On the morning the canoe was complete, she did not carry it outside. The marsh was frozen. The lakes were closed. A boat finished in winter had to become patient before it became useful. She stood beside it with both hands resting on the gunwale and listened to the building around her, stove ticking, snow sliding from the patched roof in soft sheets, chickadees working the walnut branches, the front sign creaking once in the wind. The canoe smelled of cedar, canvas, varnish, and the faint metallic memory of the steam tube that had heated its ribs. Inside, the restored rooms had not become grand. The front room held the counter, now sanded and oiled, with a glass jar for pencils and a stack of index cards weighted by a smooth lake stone. Shelves behind it carried small things, cedar shavings tied in bundles, 2 candle lantern frames awaiting mica, 3 carved paddles too plain to call decorative, and a box of brass tacks labeled by size. The floor held its dark honey color where boots had not dulled it, and a braided rug from Doris lay near the door to catch snowmelt. The back room remained a working room. Forms hung on the wall. The old tools had proper pegs now, each outline traced lightly behind it so absence would show. The steam tube had been cleaned, resealed, and fitted again to a boiler rig built from safe modern parts under Harlan's stern supervision. The plaster patches had whitened with lime wash, but remained faintly visible when afternoon light crossed them. The original back window still bent the marsh into wavering silver. On the mantel, the brass key waited in the same place it had waited since the seller gave it up. For nearly 2 years, Sadie had not known what it opened. She had tried no lock that did not seem to invite trying. She had not lifted the granite slab. She had not pried at every panel like a thief in her own house. The key had become part of the room's weather, moved only when dusting, set back each time with the craft mark facing outward. Some visitors noticed it. Most did not. Caleb once asked whether it was for the seller. Sadie said she did not know. He accepted that better than most adults would have. The answer came from the walnut tree, not from the building. In early December, after a wet snow followed by a hard freeze, one of the older limbs cracked from the second walnut and fell near the back stoop. It did not harm the roof. It landed with its broken end facing upward, exposing pale wood beneath dark bark. Sadie spent a morning cutting smaller branches for kindling and setting aside larger pieces to dry. Near the trunk, where the horseshoe had long been swallowed by growth, she noticed a line too straight to be natural. It was a brass plate, almost entirely hidden by bark. The tree had grown around it the way it had grown around the iron, folding living wood over metal without rejecting either. Only a narrow edge showed, green by age. Sadie fetched the soft brush she used for old tools and worked away loose bark with caution, not cutting living tissue where she could avoid it. The plate emerged by degrees. At its center was the craft mark. Beneath it, a keyhole no wider than her thumbnail. She stood very still. Then she went inside, lifted the brass key from the mantel, and returned to the tree. The key entered reluctantly, then fully. The lock did not turn at first. She warmed the key in her hand, breathed into the keyhole, and tried again with no force beyond steady pressure. A click sounded inside the trunk, small and exact. The brass plate loosened at one side. Sadie worked it open like a door no larger than a book. Inside the hollow was a tin cylinder wrapped in oilcloth. The tree had held it dry. Not perfectly, but well enough. The cylinder's cap unscrewed after oil and patience. Within lay a folded flag and a note sealed between 2 pieces of waxed paper. The flag was small, hand-hemmed, its cotton darkened by age, bearing 48 stars in even rows. Sadie unfolded only one corner, then stopped, afraid her hands were not clean enough for more. The note was written in a hand different from Elspeth's, heavier, with letters that leaned forward as if walking into weather. For the one who tends the tree and the water, I am Sadie Lenore Voss. I put this flag here on November 11, 1918, when the bells rang for the armistice and my son Elias came home with lungs that no bell could mend. The country is glad today, and gladness has its rightful hour, but a mother counts breath differently. If this cloth is found, let it be known that we kept faith with the living and the dead as best we could. The walnut will hold what houses may lose. The iron above it is for luck, if luck means endurance. The key shall pass to the hand that waits long enough to ask the tree politely. Do not make a shrine of grief. Make a useful thing. MLV. Birch Narrows. Sadie read the note under the winter sky, with snow balanced on the branch above her. The date was a war year. A real one. A day the world had called an ending, though many homes had received no such mercy. She looked at the horseshoe, the brass plate, the hollow tree, the shed beyond, and understood why the flag had not been kept in a drawer. The walnut had been asked to hold what paper, law, and memory might fail to protect. It had done so without announcement for more than a century. She carried the cylinder inside and placed it on the workbench beside Elspeth's letter, Peter's medal, and the tintype. Not all inheritances explain themselves separately. Some had to lie beside one another until their shape emerged. A flag hidden in a tree after one war. A medal kept in a tin box after another. A canoe shop closed and reopened by hands that had nearly frozen outside its door. The line between them was not clean. It curved like wood under steam. Earlier that same year, on June 6, Sadie had carried Peter's medal to Ely Cemetery. The date had been chosen because the card said France and the year said enough. Morning rain had darkened the cemetery road. White pines stood at the edges, dripping quietly, and the veterans' markers held small flags placed by hands she did not see. Mrs. Rukavina had helped her find the stone in the records. Harlan drove because Sadie still did not own a car, and because he said walking there with a medal in rain was devotion but not sense. They found the name cut in granite. Sadie did not make a speech. She opened the velvet case, set it against the stone for a few minutes beneath Harlan's umbrella, and stood with her hands folded. The rain touched the ribbon before she closed the case again. That was all. It was not public. It was not photographed. No one thanked her. The act did not need witnesses beyond stone, rain, and the two living people who had made the trip. The money remained mostly where it had been found. That was harder than it might sound to someone who has never been cold with cash near at hand. Need has a persuasive voice, and fear has an accountant's memory. Sadie spent what had to be spent: roof materials, chimney mortar, glass, oil, food in months when work took more from her body than it returned, and the small lawful fees that attached themselves to ownership like burrs. 3 coins left the pouch for reasons the dead might have understood. 1 bought practice cedar. 1 bought a proper whetstone when the cracked one could no longer serve. 1 paid the postage on a packet of copied route notes sent to an elder who knew how to protect such knowledge better than any county office. The rest she resealed. Not in the same hiding place, because secrecy without purpose becomes a sickness. She placed the envelopes, coins, ledgers, metal documents, letters, and flags in a fire-resistant chest Harlan helped. Her order and Reverend Boyd helped carry from the truck with surprising strength for a man of his narrow frame. Inside the chest, on top of the wrapped bundles, Sadie laid a note in her own hand for repairs, hunger, winter, and the next one. Not for grandeur. The black route ledger was copied by hand before any page left the shop. Sadie did not publish it. She did not sell maps to tourists. She did not turn hidden waterways into novelty or profit. She read enough to understand that some routes belong to weather, emergencies, and communities older than the shop itself. She wrote to the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, whose address Mrs. Rukavina helped her find, and when an answer came, careful and formal, she followed its instructions. Some knowledge was not hers merely because it had rested in her wall. Trust could be inherited, but it still had to be earned. The shop reopened without a sign saying reopened. Doris did it first, though she claimed innocence. On the cafe corkboard, between a notice for firewood and a flyer about a lost mitten, she pinned an index card written in blue ink. Birch Narrows Canoe Works. Repairs by appointment. Paddles, lantern frames, small cedar work. Leave name at counter. Sadie did not see the card until 3 people had already left names. The first was a man with a cracked paddle his father had bought in 1972. The second was a woman who wanted a cane seat repaired in a canoe she did not trust anyone else to touch. The third was a retired teacher who had no boat at all but wanted a candle lantern like the one Doris remembered. By December, The mailing list held 43 names on index cards stacked under the lake stone on the front counter. Some would never order. Some only wanted to be near the idea of such work existing again. Sadie did not mind. Waiting lists were kin to winter. Not everything on them became immediate. She opened only 3 afternoons a week at first. The rest of the time she worked, learned, repaired, read, and sometimes sat by the marsh doing nothing that could be written on an account card. The front door still stuck when humidity rose. The outhouse had been replaced by a composting toilet after more research than dignity prefers. The pump water had been tested twice. The county inspector, a man younger than Harlan and more nervous than Mrs. Rukavina, signed the limited occupancy approval with a face that suggested he did not enjoy becoming part of local folklore. There was no celebration. Doris sent soup. Harlan brought stove bolts. Mrs. Rukavina brought a copy of the recorded inspection and one of the same rolls from the cafe, though this time she did not pretend it was accidental. Nils Akri came once in spring, stood under the patched roof, and said, "Still up." That was enough from him. Caleb returned with the sign in early winter, just before the first canoe was finished. He came walking, not on the Schwinn, which had finally given up and now hung in his mother's garage. He was broader through the shoulders, his hair cut shorter, his boots muddy from the road. Under one arm he carried a board wrapped in a blanket. He stood in the doorway and knocked on the open frame because the bell had not yet been repaired. "Brought something," he said. Sadie wiped varnish dust from her hands. "For the stove?" "No." He laid the blanket on the counter and unfolded it. The sign was hand-carved from walnut. Not perfect, but made with a care that showed in every uneven letter. He had followed the old style from the weathered board outside. Long capitals. Shallow relief. The canoe mark at one end. The words read, "Birch Narrows Canoe Works and Daughter." Sadie did not touch it at first. The plural changed the room. Not because she had children. Not because she planned for any. The word did not point forward in that simple way. It pointed outward and backward at once. Daughters by blood. Daughters by need. Daughters of women who had kept routes, bent ribs, hid flags, stretched canvas, saved money in paper bands, and left instructions precise enough for cold hands to follow. Daughters who had not been named in ledgers. Daughters who arrived with no door left open anywhere else. Doris said maybe it should be daughter. Caleb said, looking at the floor. But my mother said plural. Sadie ran her fingers over the carved letters. The tool marks remained visible. Caleb had not sanded them away into lifelessness. The ampersand leaned a little. One S sat lower than the other. The canoe mark was exact. "Your mother was right," she said. He nodded, relieved and embarrassed. They hung it inside, above the front counter, because the original outside sign belonged to Weather and should not be asked to retire. Caleb held the board while Sadie marked the holes. She drilled carefully, set brass screws through the sign, and tightened them until the walnut sat flush against the wall. When they stepped back, the room seemed to adjust around it. Doris came the next day to see it. She brought paper bags, though Sadie now paid for most of what she ate. Harlan came later and pretended to inspect the screw heads. Reverend Boyd passed the front door, glanced in, tipped his hat, and walked on without stopping. Mrs. Rukavina appeared the following week with a file folder and stood quietly under the sign longer than necessary. No one clapped. The sign did not ask for that. That winter, after the first canoe was finished and before it had touched water, Sadie began writing her own letter. She used a black cloth notebook from the hardware store, not one of the old ledgers. The first page she left blank because beginnings deserved room to breathe. On the second, she wrote the date, the weather, and the state of the building as honestly as she could. Roof sound for now. Chimney repaired but watched the north face. Floor oiled. East plank near counter still soft in damp weather. Pump tested clean as of April. Cellar slab not lifted. Brass key found and used at Walnut Tree. Do not pry where patience is wiser. Then she stopped. The opening line had been waiting in her for longer than the pen had been in her hand. My dear one, whoever you are. She wrote it slowly. The words did not belong to her first. But neither had the shop, the tools, the money, the flag, the routes, or the patience that had kept her from burning through all of it in the first season of need. Inheritance was not ownership. She understood that now in her shoulders, knees, hands, and account books. It was stewardship with a human pulse. It was the duty to leave enough truth for someone frightened, hungry, or simply unprepared to begin without being flattered or deceived. She wrote about the repairs in exact order. She wrote Harlan's rule about credit and practice. She wrote Doris's demand for candle lanterns. She wrote Caleb's sign and his mother's insistence on plural. She wrote Reverend Boyd's 4 words. She wrote Mrs. Rukavina's warning that ownership meant responsibility, not merely shelter. She wrote the names from Elspeth's letter and Marge's note, though she did not pretend to untangle every branch of the family line. Some records remained broken. Some truths were held by people no paper had consulted. She wrote one warning and underlined it. Do not turn rescue into display. Then she closed the notebook for the night, because the stove needed banking and the snow had started again. Near the end of that December, Sadie carried the finished candle lantern to Doris at the cafe. It had a bent cedar frame, mica panels, and a little door that latched with a brass hook. The candle inside was new beeswax, poured by a woman outside Winton who traded 6 tapers for a repaired paddle. Doris took the lantern in both hands, set it on the counter, and did not speak for a while. Steam rose from coffee cups. Forks touched plates. A man in a corner booth read the paper with his cap still on. Finally, Doris lit the candle and turned off the light above the pie case. The mica warmed to amber. The cedar frame threw thin, curved shadows across the counter. For 1 minute, the cafe held a winter travel light that had crossed out of memory and back into use. Square, Doris said. Sadie smiled a little. Not yet. Doris looked at her. I still owe for soup. Then make another. So she did. The shop did not become famous. It did not appear in glossy magazines. No film crew came to stand in the marsh and ask Sadie to repeat the hardest parts of her life in better light. Most days remained ordinary enough to be trusted. Wood arrived. Bills arrived. Snow arrived. Customers changed pickup times. The stove needed ash removed. The pump handle loosened. A mouse found its way into the front room and had to be persuaded out with patience. A bucket, and Caleb laughing too loudly to be useful. Sadie kept no photograph of the day she first slept there. She did keep the $10 money order receipt, found later folded inside the county packet. Mrs. Rukavina had kept a copy, too. Not because she needed it, but because some clerks understand history before historians arrive. The original $10 bill had never reached the county. Of course. It had become a money order in a grocery store under fluorescent lights, after coins were counted and no one hurried her. But $1 from that change, worn soft and stamped with a bank mark from Duluth, had somehow remained in Mrs. Rukavina's desk drawer. The clerk showed it to Sadie once. Years later, when the filing cabinets had been replaced and retirement had begun appearing in conversations like weather on the horizon. "I kept it for luck, Mrs." Rukavina said. Sadie looked at the bill lying flat beneath a paperweight shaped like Minnesota. "Did it work?" Mrs. Rukavina considered. "Not luck exactly." She closed the drawer. Outside, Fernburg Road ran east under snow and pine shadow. The Nystrom dogs barked at delivery trucks and then forgot why. Harlan's store bell rang for other hands needing other repairs. Doris's corkboard held a new index card whenever the old one curled. Caleb's sign gathered dust along the top edge, and Sadie wiped it clean each Friday before opening. At Birch Narrows, the walnut tree held its healed brass plate. The cellar slab held its silence. The first canoe waded through winter for open water. The letter in Sadie's notebook grew by one page whenever she learned something worth leaving. The shed was not empty. It had been waiting. And now, when evening settled and the stove clicked softly beside the wall, Sadie sometimes stood in the open doorway between the front room and the shop, looking from the carved sign to the old steam tube to the dark window where the marsh reflected one candle. No one had come back to claim her. No one had apologized at the threshold. No old wound had been corrected by a scene large enough for strangers to witness. Instead, a building had needed work. That was the honest miracle, if the word could be used without brightening it beyond recognition. Work had taken her in without flattering her. Work had asked for exact hands, patient listening, enough food to stand upright, and the humility to learn from people who knew more. It had given her no crown. It had given her mornings. The canoe builder's shed waits. It has always waited. In a drawer in town, under county forms and a paperweight, a worn dollar bill still lies flat, kept by a clerk who once stamped a deed for a girl with hay on her coat. It is not worth more than $1. It is not proof of destiny. It is only paper that passed near the beginning, held because someone understood that beginnings are fragile and that some small things should be kept.